And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, baby, what a big surprise right before my very eyes.
Mm-hmm.
That is because CNN covered Dark Journalist. Did you ever think you'd see the day?
Never in a
Think about
years.
that. This is something else. This is one for the record books right here. And it was on the missing scientist story. And, you know, say what you want about CNN, of course, but it is interesting in this case that they moved to get the real background and the real story on it. Now, the guy who was working on the story, his name was Teddy Brown, and he had just joined over there. He has a pretty good resume of work in the background.
Right. Was it the New Yorker?
Yeah. And this is very interesting to me because they had to take a somewhat, try to take a cynical take to pick up on the threads that we're going to pick up on tonight. Like, for example, Vanity Fair and the Atlantic were trying to push down the missing scientist story. Look, there's no way to push it down. Those connections are there. The strange deaths are there. These are very high profile people. So we're coming out swinging on that. But they did a fair amount of coverage on that. The Express picked up this story as well and did a feature on us in there. So the information is getting out, is rippling through those mainstream places. And I think because of the organic nature of the story as we put it forward, that got all the way up to the White House desk, and Trump was very serious about looking into it. Now what I understand is that there's disinformation being floated his way, so he's more tamping down on the story, but we'll get into that. Tonight's very special episode, also in the aftermath of the JPL shooter, the Caltech shooter, trying to shoot up the president last weekend and trying to take out the president. Very strange attempt indeed, and we'll see why that JPL connection takes us all the way back into the occult halls of Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley, and a whole gaggle of deep state figures way back there. This is Dark Journalist X Series 224, the Occult Aerospace Ritual, NASA JPL 666. Yes, the beast number 666. I'm going to tell you why that's in there. And Steiner is going to be the one to lead us through that. And it's the Caltech UFO file. This very, very special episode is going to combine a lot of the roots of the technology, the breakaway technology, and the occult aspect lingering in the background, and then bring us directly into the story that we're tangling with now, which is disclosure, limited disclosure, mixed with the missing scientist story. Now, they can't get rid of that one. They've been trying to co-opt it. They've been trying to turn it into Chinese scientists, all this other stuff. Stick to the facts. First off, the general is missing. General McCaslin has been missing since February 27th. He was in charge of the UFO file at Wright-Patterson. There's no getting around it. And we're going to find out something very interesting about his assistant, Monica Reza, tonight as well, as we get deep into this very special episode. It's a fantastic group out there. We're going to also, I'll remind you, we'll take your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And the thing about it is you can ask the questions any point during the outing here tonight, and Miss Olivia will put those questions together before I go any further. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Indigo Spirit says, looking forward to tonight on this full moon in Scorpio. So fitting for this episode. And Moonship Book says, if DJ ever offers a class in research sources and techniques, I would scale Mount Shasta and battle an army of Nordic aliens to attend and learn. He is amazing.
Oh, it's fantastic. That would be the Dark Journalism Seminar. And if the time allowed it, it would be a fantastic thing to do. And I find people have the instincts. This is the fascinating thing. So if you give them the tools with the instincts, they're unstoppable and can be much better than the current environment of the podcast pop clicky world, which I think the ice is starting to break, and people are starting to look at that stuff and be like, the independent media started off with a lot of promise, and this thing, with a lot of money and production sheen, has only taken the value down. Well, I've pointed them out over and over again in relationship to doing a very superficial job on very deep topics. And we've talked about those, YouTube thumbnails with the person with the mouth wide open and And that's always going to be a certain amount of entertainment factor there. But I resisted it back in the day when we were doing the Secret Space program conferences and Gaia was coming out with their cheap Redux TV versions of it. And, it's very interesting to see how that thing progresses because it just moves into other territory. And the mainstream media got such a shellacking after promoting the COVID op that they needed to rebrand. They had lost a lot of credibility with the American people and people around the world. And I believe what happened, and I watched the business trends. I've been that kind of a guy for a long time where I can always see what's going on in the background. And I always have those contacts in the background that I talk to in relation to what's happening there. Because I want to see what marketing forces are pushing into the space, as it were. And I saw tremendous, hundreds of millions of dollars going into the podcast space, hiring the top TV producers to push this out there. And they would come on there and pretend like they were doing this independent rigmarole, but it wasn't at all. And in some of those shows, I would find 14 different producers and things of this nature. Whew, you got to know the environment you're in. It was always better when it was, hey, we're doing the independent media over here and you got the corporate thing there. Well, if the corporate thing goes down and then they reinvest their money in this space, then it becomes an astroturfing hellscape. And that's what we've been looking at. But I see it starting to break down a little bit because there's a lot of places where the independent media has been dropping the ball and you can't on UFO disclosure. There's a war in the background. Disclosure wars is what I call them. And you're dealing with a very exceptional exotic technology and you're dealing with a story of what happened in the background there with a lot of high profile figures politically, looking into the media, looking into finances, the whole thing is there. So if you get that story wrong, if they are able to loop out this UFO threat with the Golden Dome as the UFO defense grid, well, they'll just keep you at war forever. It's war against space now. It's easier than war against Iran, which is also going on forever. And every week or so, we hear from the administration, hey, we've won. It's over. The Iran war's over. And then, no, we haven't won. In fact, Iran has performed better than we had expected under a lot of different ways. And there's no goal here. The whole idea was we'll get rid of their nuclear weapon or whatever. Well, if you bomb everything that they have, does that really get rid of their nuclear weapon? I don't think so. So there had to be a much better way to do this. This was a blunder. And that whole team of Hegseth and all that, those guys need to be really put in a room and given a good talking to. I will say this, that there shouldn't be any money allocated for the activities in Iran through Congress. No, it should not be. We've already spent $70 billion on what? What have we got for that money? That's a very important question. And before we move into the Space Wars aspect, on the land war side, with the exercise of these defense contractors, they're exercising their power over our politicians. So, we have to stay on track and let them know who's the boss. After all, there's many, many more of us than there are of them. I'm going to read the CNN spin on the missing scientist story, which, by the way, I'm glad they covered it. Their spin might be coy or whatever it happens to be. Nonetheless, the more the story gets out there, the better, because we can provide the facts. And as long as they're covering us with it, we can bring those things on. This is also a rare moment, you have to say, where, when I was doing the conversations with them, I'd worked with the Daily Mail, for example, and a few others, Fox and others, in the background, gave them all the information that I had, and some of them ran stories on it. With CNN, they really wanted the details, and they watched the shows. So I thought that was interesting and important. So this is the story now, and it is the missing scientist story. Here's how they played it, which was how a speculative story about dead and missing scientists went from fringe to the White House. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Before this even kicked in, there were articles in the Atlantic and articles in Vanity Fair that were trying to provide a spin. And the worst of all was the Atlantic, which said the missing scientist story is unbelievably dumb. Yeah, that's right. Your national security officials get taken out and are missing A lot of them dealing with exotic technology like the UFO file or nuclear technology. How do you like that one? But that's just dumb. Well, it's dumb to look at that, right? Yeah, sure, Atlantic. So it's interesting because as we laid out the different scientists that were missing, they were trying to do a point-by-point rebuttal, and they step in it here. So I'm going to read a little bit from the Atlantic, and then I'm going to go to the CNN article. How's that?
Sounds great.
All right. What about Melissa Cassius, a Los Alamos National Laboratory employee who went missing last year? She was not a scientist at all, but rather an administrative assistant. Perhaps she had access to some classified stuff. Who knows? Well, if you were a good reporter, you would check in with Los Alamos and find out she had the highest clearance. And she was able to transport what? Incredibly important documents between classified parties. So you can't say, the idea of an administrative assistant, when you get up to that level, the higher and higher the project and the more compartmentalized and secretive, you're still going to need people in between who can do it. So she had the clearance and you didn't check it. So because she was an administrative assistant, what did you do? You were like, oh, that's just some admin, big deal. Well, she disappeared and she worked at a highly sensitive, compartmentalized facility at Los Alamos as an administrative assistant. What's not jibing there? What is it in the Atlantic that needs to take this story down? This is the thing. Where is the press coming from? Next up, another person on this list is Amy Eskridge, who was a, quote, scientist, only in the way that a subway preacher is a theologian. Think about these idiots. This is the Atlantic, When you go to the CNN article, it's like genius writing compared to that. This is the pits.
It's so snarky.
It is. Whatever fame she derived from claiming her father, a former NASA propulsion engineer, had discovered the secret of anti-gravity and that she would soon go public with this world-changing scientific breakthrough, she had also made frequent reference to a friend of hers, a katana-wielding, time-traveling soldier named Dan. Maybe Cassius, now it's interesting, they switched back to Melissa Cassius. Maybe Cassius chanced to open some ultra-sensitive file in the course of doing her job and had to be abducted. Maybe Eskridge really was onto some new technology. The bigger problem with the story is this: their deaths and disappearances aren't really unexplained. I want to bet. Well, where are they then? You want to tell us? Reza went missing while hiking, a fate that probably befalls hundreds, if not thousands of people every year. You get the tone. You're getting brainwashed into a sense of like, oh, that's what happened. I can move on and not wonder why the top UFO scientists are getting abducted or killed. Two more people on the list, a pair of JPL affiliated astrophysicists. Of course, JPL is in the spotlight tonight, so pay close attention. Jack Parsons' lab, after all, ostensibly the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. MIT physicist was murdered by a former classmate who also shot and killed two undergraduates at Brown University. Oh, and they're saying that Grillmayer, it's interesting. They were like, oh, that was just a random crime. And then this other guy, they're saying, oh, he just might have died of natural causes. Okay. MIT physicist who was murdered by a former classmate was also shot and killed by two undergraduates, who had also shot and killed two undergraduates at Brown University. Several people on the list appeared to be suffering from personal distress. Thomas, a chemical biologist, was distraught over the recent loss of both of his parents. And that's interesting. That's the guy, Jason Thomas, up here in Wakefield, Massachusetts. And it's very interesting because we spotlighted his story, and they're trying to go one by one and dismantle these. His story is very interesting because he's the one who left his smartwatch in the mailbox. Mm-hmm. This is a very interesting code going on there. And think about it. They all, over and over again, will be found to either wipe out their phones completely and leave them, or just leave them there and they go off to their secret rendezvous with deep state destiny. Now, this is interesting to me for a lot of reasons. His story was particularly strange, including the fact that they found his body 3 months later in the middle of a lake in Wakefield. But also the projects that he was working on had to do very specifically with a kind of gene therapy that you could say is biologically oriented to cloning. So you have to go deep behind the fluff of the story, but I want to continue to read a little more of Atlantic because it is just beyond stupid. Melissa Cassios had very significant personal problems, according to her daughter, and may have tried to run away from them. McCaslin was tortured by brain fog and physical deterioration. He looked completely healthy to me, and they don't list any health problems physically for him. So what are you talking about?
Yeah, that's the first I've heard of that. Where'd they get that data?
Yeah, I mean, brain fog, the guy in his 60s went to his psychologist or whatever and said, once in a while I have a problem concentrating. That's not enough to bump yourself off over. And then there's Eskridge, the anti-gravity theorist with a time-traveling soldier friend. You see how they're just going around in this interesting circle. In what seems to be her final media appearance in 2020, she is, by her own account, drunk, high, and appears to be in the grips of paranoid delusion. Look, first off, if you know anything about scientists and such like that, they have to come down off of the intensity too. And some of them will come down by having a drink or two. But the other thing is, when you are being targeted, as she said that she was, then you certainly would have need to take an edge off. So the idea that that's sort of a knock on the story, it doesn't work, actually. If anything, it supports that somebody has a nervous problem over the fact that they feel that they're being targeted. But here's the thing, because she's in Huntsville and her dad is big on the secret side of anti-gravity, and because she has done her own scientific work and has, they're not mentioning here that she's the person who founded the Institute for Exotic Science. All those things are key factors. You can't leave that out and just say, oh, she's drunk and high on something. Over the course of the interview, she claims that someone sneaked into her home while she was out and closed her bedroom window, and that in another incident, someone broke in and unplugged the charger for her boyfriend's wireless headphones. Well, when you do intimidation campaigns, if you've studied anything about deep state programs, and this works a lot if you look at people who were involved around committees, the 9/11 committee, the JFK commissions, when they researched them, there's a whole campaign of intimidation that goes on. And then when you get into cases where somebody is testifying, for example, against a pharmaceutical company, we saw large scale attacks on holistic doctors, and they were dying in, the list went somewhere into like, I think 15 or 16 different holistic doctors who died, who were all associated with GC-MAF, which was a cancer drug that was being worked on at the time. And this was just before COVID, so they got rid of a lot of those guys. One of the key stories in there was Dr. Bradstreet, and look that one up. The conditions around his death were very suspicious. You have to understand that when people think that things are happening, if you are objective, first off, you look into the possibility that it's happening before you dismiss it. Eskridge said she'd also been followed by a car with a license plate that kept changing. Now, this is very interesting because if you go into the death of NUNO LAUREIRO, the MIT professor over here, who I discovered was working on neutron star mergers, which is basically the development in a laboratory of a black hole. Yeah, that's kind of major technology there. If you look into his story, you're going to find that the license plate that his assailant uses, Claudio Valente, changes. He changes that license plate. And I tracked it back, and it's brought up in the various stories and accounts of my research in CNN and Express and others. The account that I gave is very interesting because Muhammad Atta, you go back to the 9/11 hijackings, he has a very strange thing that he does just before the hijackings, which he goes from Boston up to Maine, presumably to kind of visit some farm creamery or some ridiculous nonsense. And then his car has a Maine license plate, just like our friend Valente's car. So there is something with license plates. So instead of throwing that out the window, you should look for other parallels. And so a car with a license plate that kept changing, and she'd been roofied multiple times, and that strangers at local bars began taunting her by using buzzwords relevant to her life. I'm scared, she said near the end of the interview. I'm tired. I'm real tired. Eskridge died in June 2022. Look, when Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who had seen all the wreckage at Roswell, reemerged, there were things like the get-togethers for the 509th and all the rest of it. And he was seeking out other pilots, even though it was 30 years later, who had participated in this. And he would have private conversations with them where people would walk up to them and say, those weren't aliens that crashed in Roswell. They were monkeys. That's why they were hairless. And they had been gone through this, high atmosphere, high altitude testing. And they had all these answers for everything. I'm like, who were these people? How are they just diming in on the conversations that Marcel was having with these people, so that, if he would meet them in a cafe or whatever, these strangers would come up and start giving them alternate explanations. So those are intelligence groups. I identified them around the UFO file as X-Protect over and over again. So the person, you can see the problem is, if they have their head up their butt as a journalist, if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know anything about the UFO file, then the Atlantic, Vanity Fair, all of it becomes junk, because they're using traditional things just to get out of the idea that there's a pattern of these scientists that are dying. Now, before this article hit, and before a number of these articles hit, it was suggested that Congress would look into it. That could be very earth-shattering, and I believe this is a pushback process. And I'm going to read Vanity Fair's as well. We're going to get to the bottom of what they're doing. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight as we open up the story of the missing scientists, the JPL shooter, the history of Caltech, and how it relates directly to occult influences at NASA. We're going deep tonight. X-Protect be damned. And we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's program. I guess before I go any further, you're up.
Thomas Ball says RFIDs on license plates, they're in the registration stickers on the plates.
Oh, yeah. Excellent point. Can you imagine the things that they've developed also for, spy work and cloaking their appearance, and for the ultra secret work that they do on the intel side? I remember, this goes back a few years, but there was that famous thing of the prime minister coming out of the UK headquarters, and he had a binder with him, and the binder was red. And as soon as he got past a certain car, the thing turned green. And it was not a CGI trick or whatever. Whatever he was holding had the ability to change color. We've seen a lot of these little things. They're little hints of other technologies, other pieces of technology. And to us, it looks like a mistake or magic or whatever it might happen to be. It's them utilizing the technologies. And by the way, we are way out of the loop. If you can imagine, on the breakaway side, they have technology, in my opinion, that's at least 100 years ahead of what we have here in the public. Okay. Now, I'm going to read the CNN story and then the Vanity Fair thing. But this I thought was interesting. So, the Express, the UK Daily Express, they were doing their US version, and they covered the CNN article and did their own version. And their title was very interesting. It says, Trump implies dead scientists are expendable with confession over mystery. Quite a headline. And I'm featured very heavily in that article. But this one I thought was pretty odd. And it is true that Trump, when he got up to the microphone on this, said, I don't think that there is any connection. We'll do a report anyways, but probably no connection or whatever. I mean, no information. Who told you that? Did Kash Patel tell you that? So this was the CNN story. Now, how a speculative story about dead and missing scientists went from the fringe to the White House. And like I said, it's Teddy Brown, who I would say, as far as CNN goes, did a really good job. Levette told Ducey to look into it. We're talking, I'm going to join the article here after the opening sentence. Peter Ducey from Fox News, asked President Donald Trump about the missing scientists in person, and Trump said he had just left a meeting on the subject. On April 17th, Caroline Levette announced that the White House would launch an investigation. Okay, that's the 17th. Now we're at May 1st. Okay, it's a 2-week difference. You can see the efforts between then and now to get rid of this thing. Very important that it not be gotten rid of. On April 20th, the House Oversight Committee announced that it was planning an investigation of its own. That's what you need. If the reports are accurate, these deaths and disappearances may represent a grave threat to U.S. national security and U.S. personnel access to scientific secrets, Republican lawmakers James Comer and Eric Burleson wrote in a statement. That's absolutely true. The only thing that's missing there is you forgot to put UFO file secrets. That's the key aspect here. Behind all the high-level talk about getting to the bottom of the mystery, though, was a different puzzle. Where did the story about a purported pattern of dead and missing scientists come from? Where, oh, where indeed? Ducey's questions and the White House responses were the culmination of a 4-month journey from the fringes of the internet. That's right. Do you realize you're on the fringe of the internet there in the ideas room? And no, actually, it's the intelligent voices on this channel and in the ideas room that pushed it right to the president. A journey that demonstrated how alternative media platforms and social media can swiftly and deeply penetrate contemporary politics. Well, I agree with that. In January, note the date here. In January, Daniel LISZT, that's me, everyone, who runs the website Dark Journalist, that's the Dark Journalist show, and writes about extraterrestrial life and deep state conspiracies. Well, yeah, it's true. It's part of what we do. Recorded a 3-hour YouTube stream in which he discussed the death of NUNO LAUREIRO, the MIT physicist who was killed by Claudio Manuel Neves Valente. Valente, remember, is the Brown shooter. So what he does, very unfortunately and very sad, is he goes to Brown University, shoots 2 students who are there in the physics lab, and then he injures 8 people. So he's going blazing big time. And he's identified by a homeless person who basically camps out at Brown. And there's some kind of manhunt that goes on for him. And then he lands on LAUREIRO's porch in Brookline, Massachusetts, not far from here, close to John F. Kennedy's birthplace, I think like 2 blocks from there. And he shoots LAUREIRO in his own foyer. So, and then he takes off and he drives right up 93 and over the border into New Hampshire. But I mean spitting distance over the border, just over the border, so that when he's picked up, he's not picked up by Massachusetts police. His body is going to be picked up by New Hampshire police. And he goes into his storage room, supposedly blows his brains out, and they find him days later. Now, this is what you do. You take an assassin, you give him this mission. God knows what he thinks he's doing, but this is why really examining that science of how you build an assassin to do this is so crucial, because these sound like coordinated activities to me. Behind all the high-level talk is, where did the story come from? Okay, in January, Daniel LISZT, right, Claudio Neves Valente. Valente had killed 2 people and wounded 9 in a mass shooting at Brown University. LISZT, who has 188,000 YouTube subscribers, well, that's true. And, you know, that's under immense censorship. It's actually 189. Compared to Valente's movements, and so they talk about this and they're quoting me and they say, well, if you look at this, you know, you can see that the stuff that LAUREIRO was working on was kind of life-changing, the type of technology, neutron star mergers, and he's the head of the plasma physics lab. And then I went on to say, if you learn something, then you become sort of a database that needs to be erased potentially. From there, he went on to describe the purported historical set of deaths among scientists who had worked in the United States Strategic Defense Initiative, and then ran through some other contemporary cases, proposing that a similar pattern was emerging. You bet it was. Quote, this is my quote to them, I'd put all these things out there and I was amazed that people weren't picking up on the missing people. He said in a phone interview this month, and then everybody picked up on it, which is exactly what happened. So we worked out this pattern and we did a series of 6 episodes around the missing scientists. The thing was, the pattern itself started to pick up dramatically as people were making the connections. And we started making the connections to McCaslin and LAUREIRO, Gromer, and others, because they were all working around highly sensitive things that related to aerospace. There's no question about it. And in Ray's case, it becomes very important. We might be able to really put what she was doing on the radar with her extraordinary patent for this remarkable metal that is now used in all of our space engines. And that metal, which is so fascinating, in my opinion, comes directly out of the Roswell memory metal. And there's a whole thing in here that was about nitinol that we put on the record. And the only reason that I knew anything about it is because I had an article that was 15 years old that I had hung on to relating to nitinol. So the article was old, and it's one of these things that came up when we'd had this dust up with the guy who was plagiarizing me, the Peter Thiel channel. The reason that I knew that he was ripping hard in that last episode in particular on the missing scientists was because he had taken the nitinol story about the nitinol thing. And what had happened was nitinol was this incredible metal that they had, but it was sort of a flat patent in the 1940s. And then a remarkable thing happened right after the Roswell incident, which is this thing became incredibly dynamic and used in everything. And what had happened was they had piggybacked a different type of process on the top of it and moved it into an existing patent. This is how X-steganography works when you're dealing with these different things. I'm going to put Monica Reyes' patent right in the heart of this mystery tonight as we go a little bit deeper. Let me finish up this CNN article and we'll get to it. What do you got there?
Thomas Payne says, I'm still very new to all this, and this might be a dumb question. There are no dumb questions. But why do they, quote, leave behind their phones or smartwatches? Is that intentional?
Well, you have to understand it. Think about it as a pattern. Obviously, if you leave your house or if I leave my house, we're not going to leave our phones behind. Who would in this day and age? I mean, it's pretty rare. But if you have a series of devices like a smartwatch or that counts your steps and all that kind of stuff, to leave them all behind is coordinated. In some cases, like Melissa Cassios, she goes home to leave the phone there because she's at work. So there's no reason to do this. So what we would have to do is speculate, but it represents a pattern since we see it throughout the missing scientist cases. And what you could easily speculate that part of the protocols for that type of highly sensitive, secretive work, when you get to it, there's a protocol that says, when you get up to this level, when you get a command that says, leave everything off, so you can't be tracked, leave it all and walk, 3 miles in this direction and we'll pick you up and, we'll have a conversation. Whatever it is, they're under instructions. In the case of Melissa Cassios, and it's one of the reasons, because I highlighted her case heavily, and it's one of the reasons that really annoyed me about the Atlantic thing and why there were such dodo birds over there being like, she's an administrative assistant. People who work in very secretive, sensitive environments have all types of different jobs. And in her case, she had to, show her badge, her clearance badge to the guy getting in when she was getting into the Los Alamos lab that day. And she did. And then at a certain point, she says to a coworker, I need to go home. I have to go get my badge. And, that wasn't true because she was already wearing it, according to the guy who checked her in. So she had the excuse. She went home. She wiped her phones. She left them there. Along the way, she delivered lunch to her daughter at school. And then the last thing she's seen walking along the street and then disappears, never heard from again. It was what I had surmised is that she was the intermediary working because we had this thing about McCaslin. We had this thing about Reza, and Reza had worked with McCaslin over 5 years and they had been redeveloping the Roswell aspect. So you're all in the proximity there. And my guess is that somehow in relation, because she disappears right within a month of Monica Reyes. So it's all happening in this kind of particular loop of time and all in the same general environment around Albuquerque, New Mexico, for that group. So what happens is you take out the team who was working on the thing and you do it piecemeal. One person disappears, then another person disappears. 6 months later, the other person disappears, and they're all gone and nobody's supposed to ask any questions. And if they do, the Atlantic is ready to say, no way. On February 20th, they go into this whole thing about Jessica Krause. And I think what they're trying to do here is say like, she's a MAGA influencer, and therefore the fact that she supported the missing story means that this is some like crazy MAGA theory, but quite the opposite. In fact, So, but they do pick up after they do that. They go back to William Neal McCasland and how his disappearance also attracted the attention of Tim Burchett. Now, Burchett, who was one of the first government officials to speak about the purported links among the group of scientists. Burchett said in an interview that he was tuned into the whole thing for a while, and he said he received calls from sources that something odd was starting to happen or had started happening. McCasland's disappearance in February was the catalyst for him to take a closer look. He disappeared. He left his home with no phone, no glasses, no keys, but he took his revolver. That's also interesting. Burchett said there's no evidence that he took it with him. His gun was unaccounted for. There's no evidence he took it with him that day. Okay, fair enough. So they go on and talking about the rest of this. And then they go to how the Daily Mail sets off this whole storm. Now, we had done, I had sent all this information to the Daily Mail about the memory medal and the disappearance of Monica Reza and all the rest of it. And then they start talking about that. And then my quote to them was, the Daily Mail got in touch with me in February to talk about the report I put out, LISZT said, but it wasn't until McCasland went missing that they ended up wanting more info about it. He said that Chris Malore, the Daily Mail science editor who was written all of the tabloids coverage on the conspiracy, has watched several of his videos on the topic. Yeah, he had told me he'd seen the whole series. Among the Daily Mail sources was Burchett, who is quoted as saying of McCasland, there have been several others throughout the country that have disappeared under suspicious circumstances. What is it that the media on this can't get their heads around? These are very high-level people under very sensitive projects, and they are disappearing. Do you have to be a conspiracy theorist to think that maybe they're being abducted? No. In his phone interview, he said McCasland's disappearance struck him as yet another entry in a long ledger of alleged alien researchers meeting mysterious ends. Now, I've said this about Burchett before, that, he goes around grandstanding on this stuff. However, he's right about this, which is there is a series of people and they're associated directly with the UFO file. So if Congress wants to get into it and really do a good job, I'm 100% behind that for sure. And then they do a whole thing on Luna and all the rest of it. And I was disappointed to hear Luna's doing, they announced that they're going to do this thing on May 13th. And I was like, oh, good. They're going to do the missing scientist thing because, time is of the essence. And so they're going to do it on MK Ultra. Well, good luck. Hopefully they do, a good job with that. But the timeliness of the missing scientists, how can you have that committee, which is supposed to be about getting to the truth and all the rest of it, the D-class committee, and not do anything on this, or wait till the languishing summer months when all the attention on this has gone off? It's not smart. So they go into a thing about Benny Johnson, Barstool Sports, and all the rest of it. But you can see this is very hardcore. And their final thing with me is, for devoted explorers of UFO mysteries, something was getting lost in the noise of popular attention. I appreciate the fact that the story is getting around and the awareness is growing, LISZT said, but you get the distortions when the story starts merging with other stories that don't fit the pattern. He pointed specifically to the inclusion of the deaths of several Chinese scientists working across AI and advanced weaponry in the conspiracy, as in a Newsweek headline from April 23rd reading, Chinese scientists have been dying mysteriously of mysterious deaths too. But by then the story already belonged to big-time podcasters. Joe Rogan spoke about the missing scientists on his podcast, giving the theory perhaps its largest audience to date, and so on and so forth. And then they say here, to top it off, a speculative story about a group of dead and missing researchers has gone from outsider hypothesis to mainstream topic on its way to becoming conventional wisdom endorsed at the highest level of government. So it's sort of like a backhanded endorsement indeed. So they did, they did their job on it. And I would say overall, considering it's the mainstream media, they did a good job. But you see the pushback here, and the idea is that somehow, well, this got to the president's desk. How did that happen? It happened organically without the corporate media getting it to the president. You see what I mean? So when it happens in this organic way, they have to run around in these circles like Vanity Fair and Atlantic and others and push back on that story. The Wall Street Journal just recently did the same thing. So those people just have to defend their territory and how things happen. But the truth is, we can organically get that story directly to the president because we have the expertise in the background on the UFO file. And we've been putting this forward for a long, long time about the groups that are involved in suppressing different types of discoveries related to the UFO file. When you get that going, when you get that information out there, if you can get it to people and they can see it, if it's not pushed down by Google or crowded out by PopClip podcast, you can get something really important going. That's, I think, the lesson in this. And, the fact that Express and others did their own types of versions of it, I'll take it. Whatever it is that they do, that's fine. Because in my opinion, getting the nature of that story around is important. And as long as I'm quoted accurately and all the rest of it, that works for me. But here's the cover of Vanity Fair on that. 11 scientists are dead or missing. It was only a matter of time before conspiracy theories hit the White House. Huh? Those darn conspiracy theories. You just can't get rid of them. And you can't get enough of them either. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, in this case, the conspiracy theory is probably the least of the troubles around this one. This represents a major, major problem of people being eliminated over their knowledge and work with the highly secretive UFO file, which has gone so far away from the average person's oversight that even our representatives don't know what's going on. What kind of a situation is that? That's the question we need to ask. As we get into this tonight, X-Series 224 tonight, this is Occult Aerospace Ritual, NASA JPL 666. I put that in there for a reason. Caltech, there's a Steiner explanation. UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions. I'll remind you in the second half of the program tonight. I'm also going to remind you, if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch around this massive, crazy censorship and the attempt to control this story. The only thing that will happen there is you'll get every Friday a newsletter about the extraordinary things we have for you, documentaries, the whole docuseries that we're doing relating directly to this about aerospace assassinations, absolutely off the charts. And we just did a whole thing on the Blue UFO program, and of course our ongoing series on the craze in the hot zone about all of the ancient ruins relating directly in the Bahamas to this mystery school prophecies. All of that's in there, and it's in the newsletter along with the fantastic, and I mean off the charts interviews that are coming up for you this May. And of course, mind-blowing X-Series episodes. It's all in there. Make sure you stand up and be counted. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Tom Spall says, LIVESTREAM won't tell you we are winning. And DJ Beto says, remember, conspiracy theorists predict the future as we have more points of reference.
Oh, that's a really good point. Well, conspiracy theorist was something that the CIA came up with. Now, that's been released now. They came up with it in 1969 in relation. They were getting really hammered on the JFK situation because everyone knew the CIA was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. And they were like, how do we get this, And they said, well, the first thing you do is you don't talk about it unless you really have to. So don't go off talking about how we bumped off President Kennedy. Thank you very much. And then the next thing was, if it comes up, call the person in question who's come out with, the research around it. Call them a conspiracy theorist, because then they'll be marginalized and all the rest. So that's how they came up with it. And the mainstream media got the memo back then and has just been doing it 60 years ever since. And it's very interesting if you think about it, because a lot of research communities came out. If you go back and look at that history, it was the 1960s that created a much deeper spectrum of voices in the background, and they were looking into things. And a lot of it, the catalyst was that their leaders were being killed and that their kids were being sent off to foreign wars, and they didn't seem to have a say in anything. So it's very interesting that sort of bifurcation that takes place at that point relates directly around the era of the space program. And if you can put those two together, as we have on this show, you start to understand the role of aerospace in the heart, in the middle of all this, around all the deep state activity. So before I dive in on aerospace's role in all this, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Fire says, is there some type of mind control involved in all of these missing scientists?
Oh, it's an excellent question. I'll tell you why. Because part of taking a position, a highly sensitive position, if you are a real true believer and you have this incredible record, like McCaslin did, and I want to say this too, we need to understand that these people are regular people in extraordinary circumstances. So if they're missing, we have to imagine it's like a relative, missing. And we have to think of it on that level instead of just as like a news story. And those are the machinations that these media, the media coverage should be going through. They should be looking at the people as real people and not trying to caricature them, like they were in the case of Amy Eskridge, for example. But once they get into that position, somebody like McCaslin, they could accept as part of their national security role, you're going to take a certain amount of hypnotic suggestions so that if we need to act fast, we can contact you and hit your subconscious directly with a particular phrase, and that will ignite you into a whole different kind of activity, and it'll set off this national security protocol. There's a movie. It's a weird movie too. It's from the late 70s. Do you remember? This is an obscure one. Telephone.
Yeah.
Charles Bronson, and the whole thing is about them activating these spies, in some cases for self-destruction through these different phone calls and things. So that protocol has been in place for a long, long time. But certainly, I've always felt hypnosis is the great unknown, or unspoken truth in the heart of all these types of things. Yeah. What else you got?
Are you bringing up Chandra Levy at all tonight?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because that just happened today. And look, it's very unusual, but the 25th anniversary of her death came up, and her
Today?
parents, and her parents were giving an interview, and, they were talking about the strangeness of the case and how the person who was accused and who had originally pleaded guilty, he got a different trial. And then the prosecutor said, we don't want to put him on trial. We want to send him back to El Salvador. And they did. And he was trying to stay here. It's a very weird story. But then at the end of it, they start talking about how she had a great interest in the UFO file, and how the person that she was dating, the congressman from California, that he was on the Senate Intelligence Committee on a UFO project. Now, that's interesting regardless of what you think of it. And I think it's Gary Condit. And it would be very interesting to look at his background and what he was doing, say, around 2000. I know because he hid his relationship with her and all that, he got accused of killing Chandra Levy. And, they put all this incredible emphasis on it. What gets missed in that story is, how was he related to a UFO program? That's not widely known. So they put something on the record there that I think a lot of people are going to follow up on.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know much else about Condit and Levy around the UFO file. Very strange. Very, very unusual. All right. I wanted to touch on one more naysayer before we get into this. And it's very strange that you have people objecting to the investigations and coverage of the missing scientists who are coming in from these different strata of the establishment. But one of them is our friend over here at Harvard, Avi Loeb, our good pal Loeb. Well, what was it that Loeb was doing? Loeb, he was running a whole fear campaign last fall about 3I Atlas and doing the whole, it's coming for Earth, it's piloted, it's an alien threat, and all the rest of it. Again, sitting there as this Harvard Galileo guy. And it's interesting because Galileo project, originally, I put this on the record before, the idea was, you're going to have all these scientists doing the UFO thing at Harvard. Well, that doesn't sound so bad. Then immediately starts staffing the whole thing. Intelligence guy this, intelligence guy that, CIA guy this, NRO guy that. Complete waste of time, because they're never going to give the public any truth. And two of the people he had on the board, actually, Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon, two of the biggest liars, counterintelligence people around the UFO file. So, but this is interesting. This is his response to the whole thing. Are you ready? We have a missing science problem, not a missing scientist problem. The White House, Congress, and several federal agencies are currently investigating a loosely defined list of recent deaths and disappearances. About 10 scientists, it's more, and staff with potential ties to classified research. Congressman Comer, who chairs the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and Congressman Burleson, who chairs the subcommittee, stated officially here that they are investigating cases as a potential threat to national security. Now, this set off all kinds of alarm bells in the deep state. I can tell you, they keep going after this Comer announcement. They do not want that investigation. And they might have us sort of fluffing around with this, hey, MK Ultra, May 13th set of hearings. Let's get on with the missing scientists hearings now while the trail is still fairly warm. Related families deny a connection between the tragedies associated with their loved ones and prior classified work. In particular, Susan McCaslin Wilkerson wrote that she wanted to dispel misinformation since her husband, William McCaslin, had retired for more than a decade before he disappeared. Let me show you how this works. First of all, I'm sure she's in a tragic situation and all the rest of it, but they can pinch little quotes here and have the family, taken in a certain context. But if you look into what McCaslin was doing as part of that retirement, he was working as a consultant for what? Blue Halo. If you know anything about blues, we put it on the record in this program. Well, Blue Halo, if you go into that company, it's very interesting because they are one of the companies who have been hired in this huge boondoggle to build the Golden Dome. Well, the Golden Dome is going to be a massive UFO defense grid. There's no question about that. Trump himself has said, it's Star Wars 2, baby, but now we have the technology. Well, Reagan did Star Wars 1, the Strategic Defense Initiative. They spent tons of money on that and apparently got very good results in terms of tracking UFOs. And the whole idea of blocking out Russian missiles became very secondary after they realized what this thing could do. Highly secretive technology and associated with a wave of 22 deaths, especially from the Marconi Foundation. And the group, Marconi was dealing with aerospace and all the science aspects, and the aspect in the UK had the highest amount of deaths in relation to that. So this pattern loops in and loops out. So if you really look at what McCaslin was doing, when you're retired, you're called in to consult on different things, especially if you were the one who was running the UFO file for over a decade. So keep that in mind when people are knocking this down. And then they're talking here about Michael Hicks, JPL scientist, had been struggling with known medical problems before his death. And so they have his daughter saying, from what I know of my dad, there's no train of logic to follow that would implicate him in the potential federal investigation. I don't understand the connection between my dad's death and the other missing scientists. Well, they have to look at them, you see, because they're all disappearing around a particular aspect, particular edge, and somebody who's involved in aerospace would fall under that umbrella. And they can look at it in a very respectful manner, you can see. But the idea, the way that they're coming at them, when they respond to these things, are probably like, what do you think about those crazy internet rumors about scientists? Do you think your dad was part of that? What is the person supposed to say? Yeah, he was part of a UFO working team and he had too much knowledge and they bumped him off. Most people aren't going to say that even if they're thinking it. So let's get real about some of these responses. President Trump called the pattern of missing scientists possibly random and stated to reporters, hopefully, I don't know, coincidence, whatever you want to call it, but some of them are very important people. We're going to look at it over the next short period. And then he would show up 4 days later and say, I don't think there's anything connecting these or whatever. But all you have to do literally is put one CIA guy in there to brief the president and say, I'm not finding those combinations, Mr. President, and that's it. So he has to have the type of information coming in organically and outside of the bubble, national security bubble that they have going on there. They're so anxious to get back to bombing Iran that they don't want anything to distract from that. And what Avi Loeb wants us to know, Mr. Three-Eye Atlas is coming for you and your children. Watch out. Here come the aliens. UFO threat man from Talpiot Intelligence. Hello, Israeli intelligence. Not exactly reliable these days. I also added the main problem we currently have is that science is missing from our national priorities. Instead of entertaining budget cuts in federal science agencies like NASA or NIH, the U.S. government should celebrate the benefits of science through global leadership. In dozens of television and radio interviews that I had over the past week, I was asked about the missing scientists. And I clarified that I do not believe the cases are connected, but the FBI should check it if there are adversarial nations behind any one of them. In short, the problem is the U.S. is not about missing scientists, but about missing science in our national conversation. Says Avi Loeb, who wants $3 billion to investigate UAPs with his telescope on top of astrophysics lab. You know, so these are the types of people that are put in place literally to tamp down when something gets out of hand. Yes.
This just feels like the COVID op. You know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They just shamed independent researchers in alternative
Absolutely.
media.
Yes.
They created suspicion, created a sense of danger. Of
Yep.
These people, misinformation,
Yeah, oh, yeah.
disinformation, malinformation.
Nope. Well, I'll tell you, we're trying to say here, you remember when you're talking about COVID, just before that, there were a lot of stories and things that were coming out, and that's how President Trump rode in on that populism wave in the first place in 2016. And the media came up with this term fake news, and they wanted to use it against all the podcasters and Trump and everything else. And what happened was the podcasters and Trump used it against the media so that everyone started to call them fake news. So they started to shut up with the term after that. So this is the nature of the kind of environment that we're in. Yeah, what else you got?
Okay, so Thomas says it's really dumb of the mainstream media to say there's no connection. As DJ just said, look at what they studied: anti-gravity plasma physics.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And, you know, there's no question that they don't want to look into this. This is the nature of part of the problem.
I mean, just on the face of it, I say, as a citizen, the government wastes money, period. We know this,
Yes.
right? You know, so what harm is it going to do to
Right.
look into it, right? Maybe see if there's something there.
Exactly.
Really, like, why does this have everybody's panties up in a bunch? I
Right.
just don't understand what the problem is.
Avi Loeb is like, I'm not going to get my $3 billion, you know. It's very strange. Remember this photo that came out showing a, you know, large plane tracking a UFO over Scotland. The shot was taken in 1990 and was left in the doldrums of the Ministry of Defense because they didn't want it to come out. Although this is a public shot, and you know, it's been colorized here or whatever it was. But the truth is, you know, these are the types of things that they keep to themselves. This is the nature of the problem. So one of the things that I postulated, I want to go back to Monica Reza here for a moment, and then we're going to use that as a springboard to get us into the whole case around JPL, Parsons, CROWLEY, and the very strange things relating to the birthplace of NASA. By the way, you probably don't know this, but JPL and basically the birth of NASA happened on Halloween. And every Halloween, what do they do at Caltech? A whole festival celebrating the founding of Jack Parsons' lab. Don't tell me that's not some kind of backhanded ritual relating directly to it, but it's such a tradition now that probably only the little secret science societies inside there even know what that's all about. One of the things that I've pointed out is that the real program that the government has for the UFO file is called Blue, okay? And if you've watched this program, you know I've sounded off about it enough, but I did a whole documentary about it. When I did the documentary and the original shows on it, it was spring of 2023. And then this thing started to percolate so much that in 2024, about a year later, the government had to come out and say, yeah, we did have a program. And it was called Kona Blue, and it was about crash retrievals. But we never had any crash retrievals, so we didn't find anything, so it doesn't matter. Which is completely false. But in any case, they knew that it had got out, whether it was through me or through somebody else. But in this case, it was through me. And the Blue program, we put all that stuff on the record, did documentaries on it. everyone in the ideas room or who watched the show knew about blue before they announced it. Now I've been putting blue in the spotlight and in focus more and more. And now you'll see that, for example, in the case of Amazon, as part of Blue Origin, this is what they're doing now, and listen closely. The Blue Ring platform, a Swiss Army knife in space. This comes from Defense One. At the heart of the proposal is Blue Origin's modular spacecraft platform, originally designed to serve as a versatile transport and mission host for satellites. Blue Ring could, if approved, double as the backbone of a future planetary defense system. Well, why do you need planetary defense unless aliens are attacking, right? So it's a UFO grid. Planetary defense system. The spacecraft is engineered to carry multiple payloads and operate across a range of orbits, potentially from low Earth orbit to Sishmar space. The Neo Hunter concept would see Blue Ring launch a fleet of small interconnected satellites called CubeSats to rendezvous with suspected asteroids. And, you know, we had this incredible rush of fireballs and asteroids and things falling, you know, and I was doing a show with Alex Jones a couple of weeks ago when this was happening. And he was saying, oh, there are people all over, you know, just saying that they saw a crashing asteroid or, you know, they saw these meteorites coming in and burning up in the atmosphere all over Austin. These stories were going on. And here was Blue Origin and Amazon rolling out Neo Hunter to get rid of those city-killing asteroids, you know. So you can see a lot of coordination. If you look for it, it's there. I guess that's the point. But NASA's planetary defense efforts, watch this. Blue Origin concept complements ongoing work by NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office, PDCO, which is systematically cataloged and monitored NEOs that threaten Earth. And that's any kind of killer asteroid that's out there, right? They're coming for us. So I guess you know, I'm going to say that's enough on that, but just to give you the idea, you can see something's afoot going on and that Blue Origin is definitely related to it. And when you get into that, you start to see the level of coordination that's going on in the heart of this. You got SpaceX on one side, you know, doing what they're doing and gobbling up all of the UFO data that they have. They won't talk about it. Then you have Elon Musk saying, well, Jared Isaacman has to get in at NASA. And Trump originally said, no way, Jose. He's a Democrat. I'm not going to go for it. You know, and doesn't have the right experience, the right age. No. And so that's when you saw SpaceX Musk freak out on Trump and say he went to Epstein Island and all this crazy stuff. Well, later on, in fact, what happened? Trump let Isaacman through, and Isaacman is now the billionaire running NASA. Well, let's see what kind of a job he does, but he keeps referring back to, oh, we're going to do this whole thing about a moon, you know, colony up there. When you think about this, you have to keep in mind what these people are really signaling and how when they talk about this, you know, there's no explanation. Somebody should sit down and just say, the last manned mission to the moon was 1972. In all of these articles about it, and trust me, I've scanned them for years, they all say, oh, they gave up that program because it cost too much money. It was already allocated for the next 3 missions. They'd already paid the money. They'd already built the stuff. So it's not money. It was not money. It's because that whole apparatus had to become secret and had to go off the books. And that's when you had weird, gigantic black holes of money going into somewhere, just rifling out the back door. So the second architecture has to do with space on one side, and as we talk about the continuity of government program on the other. And be very careful, you know, when I refer to the continuity of government program, I'm working off the research of Professor Peter Dale Scott. He's the real ace in all of that literature around underground bases and the congressional situation relating to the secrecy around COG. He tracked the whole history and went deep into it. If you see flimsy stuff out there about COG this, COG that, see where the source is that they're drawing from, because that's going to be crucial. And hopefully they're drawing from this show or from the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott. And of course, that is the heartbreaking last image of General McCaslin. There he is. And that was the role where he disappeared. That was the kind of thing that he was wearing. So I want to go into this metal aspect before, and then jump into JPL because it's related directly. So there's a Roswell aspect here. There's an exotic technology aspect here. And there's a patent here that relates to the missing scientists. Now, as I said, I held on to this story in the background as part of my Roswell research. This one is from 2009. How long ago is that? 17 years ago? It's May 21st, so it's pretty damn close. Memory metal files are missing. This is what I'm trying to focus the news media upon. With a boost from Sarasota resident Tony Begalia, the enduring Roswell UFO controversy is about to swing the spotlight onto one of the most successful research and development entities in America, Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio. Now, what happens in short is that this kind of not so well performing nitinol in the 1940s, as I mentioned, gets this tremendous boost in the late 40s, but all the research papers and update reports and all that stuff disappear. And so Battelle, which is where all of the Roswell material was rumored to go after it went to Wright-Patterson, because they had the right types of facilities to fulfill putting that, to the test scientifically in that particular era, they hid under the fact that they said, we're a nonprofit, we're not technically the government, so we don't have to keep those records. That raised a lot of alarm bells. Remember, this is going back now, 2009. This is, people who are concerned about Roswell start to bring this up. Okay, the Miami Herald Tribune. At issue, there are some missing reports from Battelle's study of a nickel-titanium alloy named nitinol, renowned for its resilience as a memory metal, contracted by the U.S. Air Force to assess and exploit its compelling properties in the late 1940s. Battelle participation in or manages 6 national laboratories for the U.S. Department of Energy, including Oak Ridge, Lawrence Livermore, and Brookhaven. And of course, that's where they have kind of a smaller version of CERN. Problem is, neither Battelle nor the United States Air Force can produce copies of what the scientific literature refers to as second progress reports. This is very important. On contract, Begalia suspects that because the data is still highly classified due to its source, a flying disc that crashed outside Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Now, can we conceive that in the middle of the missing scientist story is this Roswell material? Well, it's true that Roswell now would have happened next year, some 80 years ago, but it went through the system. They took many years to redevelop what it could do. And by the time you get to Monica Reyes's patent, suddenly it's completely, now it's no longer a government project and therefore can no longer be tracked by the government because she's the sole owner of it. Well, she actually had a partner with it, but that woman passed away of breast cancer in 2014, a fellow scientist. Okay, personal testimony is one thing, says Begalia, whose research skills have been polished by his business as an executive search consultant. When you start talking about the documents and the history of science, unlike testimonials, their provenance is not questioned. And so some of the people around the Roswell story, you see, got involved with this. This was a while ago. And remember that Reza is the one who had the patent. Now, Reza is going to come up again because the Rocketdyne company that she worked for, where she developed this, is going to have a very early connection with Jack Parsons. I kid you not, everyone. We're going deep, deep tonight. And there's going to be a TKO in the heart of that. X-Series 224, Occult Aerospace Ritual, NASA, JPL 666, Caltech UFO file. And I put that 666 aspect in there because there's a very important crossover from the occult imaginings of people like Aleister Crowley and Parsons about aerospace and the spirits of the air and the spirits of the moon and space and things like that, which are going to become very important here. Before I go any further, what have you got?
Ratboy Genius says if Reza patented nitinol, this could have been a legal dilemma for the aerospace corporations that had already been fabricating it off the books.
Yeah, excellent point. Well, here's how I'll round out that story. And there's a big, huge breakthrough about this that I've come across here that may open the story up. Let's see. Tonight is going to be crucial for this. But here's where it stood in what I put out there about Monica Reza. And this is very important because the way that the progression works is very interesting. If you look at nitinol, it's around in the 1940s. They have very low reports, low marks. They have hopes for what it could do, but it's one of these nickel alloys. By the time you get to Mondeloi, which is her creation, it's the exact same type of alloy again, but it's incredibly supercharged. It can do all these wonderful things. Now, nitinol, before it has her big upgrade with Mondeloi, then it becomes, in 1949, used in all these different things because they've redeveloped it. As I said, the piggybacking of the project from Roswell and the memory metal there. Some of the original accounts from Roswell help us to understand because it's how an ordinary person would look at the bizarre things that this can do. Now, Marcel himself described it in a number of different ways. He's like, it had no weight to it, and at times it would levitate. And you couldn't do anything to it. But particularly important to me in the descriptions, you couldn't bend it, you couldn't burn it. Burn it, very interesting to me. So it has a memory metal because you could fold it in any shape and it would go right back to flat. Now, it's very interesting because the burning aspect becomes the key aspect of Monica Reza's patent. So it's about this thing can sustain any heat, but still continue on. So they got to a point, say around the early 2000s, where her work with McCaslin, the catalyst for this entire thing. And if he'd been working on it in the background, as we know through the WikiLeaks drops that it was, then that you're looking at the team there around something that became advanced exotic technology that is used now throughout the space program. It's a public technology now, so it's a part of that, but it comes out of this very secret process. And you can imagine at a certain point, they may have said, well, there's an issue here. What I want to say about the memory metal and why it's so crucial and why it's missed in all the news stories, whether it's CNN, Express, or Fox, or anybody who's done the stories based on my work, they miss the Roswell memory metal story. Daily Mail and all that, they didn't have it in there. It's the crucial aspect because that's where this whole thing comes out. Read the descriptions. The descriptions are on record and by intelligence officers in that era. They knew a great deal about it. I'm going to read a description from one of the earliest books on this. And I want to put us in that mindset of the memory metal. Then I'm going to show how Monica Reza's background relates to all this, including the fact of Rocketdyne and how Rocketdyne actually came out of a Parsons company at Caltech. And what has that got to do with Aleister Crowley? We're going to find out. What do you got?
I'm just wondering, do you think they missed it intentionally? Were they warned off? Don't report on that aspect of the story? Because as being a journalist, that would be a really juicy aspect.
I would think so too. Excellent point. Well, I can only speculate about why the editors and stuff wouldn't pick up on this. But they may have said, well, it's the Roswell story. We've got missing scientists. Let's just leave it out. We'll see if we can do the UFO thing without it. But the fact is, I gave them all the information around this, including the fact of that article. That article is so important because it's just this thing that's hanging around. And it's amazing. I put on the record the TTSA with all the CIA controllers that were driving that company to the Stars Academy, who had Tom DeLonge as the Bobo out front. And he's the one who has the emails with McCaslin, remember? So those people, those CIA handlers of DeLonge for TTSA, and that's on record, by the way, that's, Jim Semivan and others, 25 years in the CIA, directorate level, the top guys, right? That's their own material. That's not me suggesting it. And guys like Semivan and all the others, they're out there. And what do they do? What does the TTSA do with their first round of kind of spending money? they create a contract with the Army to give them metamaterial, so-called. This is the exotic material aspect. And one of the people that they go to, it's very public in our little UFO arena, is our friend Linda Moulton Howe. And what do they say? They say, you know that little thing that Art Bell left you, it was sent in by an engineer who gave it to him, and Art was convinced it was a piece of the Roswell crash? Art's parts, we'll give you $35,000 if you give that to him. And, you know, Linda was like, good. Will you do some good research on it? Fine. That's it. You know, disappears into weird TTSA, CIA background. And then weird story shows up in Popular Mechanics where they're like, remember that thing that was supposed to be alien metal? Apparently it wasn't, because the CIA tested it. It didn't work out to be anything unusual. So you see how this whole thing is controlled. What I'm suggesting is that just like in the original crash with Roswell, you had a number of trained soldiers out there vacuuming up all of this exotic material. When you get a group out there and they realize, oh, this Mundaloy is actually dominating the entire space, we have to make sure nobody else gets their hands on this thing. There's a vacuuming up program to make sure there's no little pieces of this thing hanging around anywhere. That's where I think TTSA came out of. And that's where I think the whole story with Linda and all the rest comes out of. That's the realization here that could rock the entire story. And we would at least understand the team, McCaslin, Reza, and their administrative assistant there, Melissa Cassios. We would understand what happened to them in relation to this. That's why that's so crucial. But here's a wonderful book by Don Schmidt, The Children of Roswell, where they go around and find these different stories of what the children saw and what the children did in the aftermath of their parents having to deal with this. So we have some descriptions here that give us a little bit of a background. We're now satisfied that the explosion of the Roswell UFO crash occurred 75 miles northwest of Roswell late in the evening of July 2nd, 1947, in the town of Corona. We also know that the rancher, William Mack Brazel, done some interesting things about Brazel, including the fact that after the crash and everything, when he was told, you know, don't talk about this anymore, and if anyone asks you, just say you were wrong. And then suddenly he has this incredible financial uplift. And he was seen being interrogated and things by the Air Force. Now, it's interesting also that in a year later, his son will disappear. And, you know, he's missing, he's thought dead or whatever. And according to people around the family, he turns up some 20 years later in Oregon. So, you know, this is some of the moves. Again, whenever you get around the UFO thing, you're dealing with manipulation of family members and others. Mac Brazel discovered the crash wreckage in a sheep pasture on his ranch, which was owned by J.B. Foster. We did a remarkable series last summer called Roswell Reignited, which goes into the whole history of the Fosters, and it gets very strange. The military did not arrive in force at the ranch to commence the cleanup of the crash site until late the following Tuesday. So there's time here where people pick up parts of it and all the rest. So the news didn't travel quickly to surrounding ranches. It was almost like a family affair for the ranch owners, their children, and the ranch hands and their children to visit such crash sites to see what had happened. And to help anyone who might need help to retrieve souvenirs. It was no different in the case of a crashed spaceship from another world. So the ranch population in the Corona area, to some extent the ranchers just northwest of Roswell, had about 5 days all as themselves to pick over the wreckage before the military arrived and secured the crash sites. It stands to reason that any number of souvenirs must have been successfully retrieved by the adults and children before the military got there. This is where this research becomes, I think, very interesting. But just to round all this out now, something D. Proctor discussed in depth and elsewhere in his book, in this book. Suffice it to say here, because he refused to ever be interviewed at length about what had happened at Brazel's sheep pasture or what might have happened to him afterward at the hands of the military, most of what we know about him was obtained from his mother, the late Loretta Proctor, who, with her husband Floyd, were Mac Brazel's nearest neighbors. And he goes on to say here, something had terrified him into a stony silence that nobody, not even members of his own family, could break through to get him to talk about what had happened out there in the desert. We as investigators tried on several occasions to interview him, but he always somehow was able to avoid us. The closest we ever got one day as we were entering the front door of his mother's house to interview her and hopefully Dee, we heard the back door quickly slam shut. Dee had escaped again. Years later, Dee would partially break his nearly 50-year silence when he packed his sick mother into the pickup truck for a bumpy ride. He stopped the truck, pointed upward towards the ridge stop atop the bluff and said, "Here is where Mac found something else." That's all he said. His mother couldn't get him to say any more than that, but D. Proctor died in 2006. And what happened is when they go into the story, all these people had some aspect of the memory metal and weird things, a number of weird things that happened to them. One of the weird things that had happened was people were testing out and keeping aspects of this memory metal. And the strange stories around what the metal could do and the different ways that the town participated in it, including, having a box of it go to the sheriff and, all the rest of it. This is all before Marcel is even there dealing with it. So you already can see the wheels turning about this stuff going into different places. And that cleanup crew would go up all the way to 1952. It's the last report that I got, where if you look into it, in 1952, they go into this bar. These kind of MPs go into this bar and they grab the guy behind the bar, and it turns out his family is terrified. What happened? And he said, "Well, I don't know what the big deal was. I kept some of the stuff from that huge crash from a few years ago. And remember that weird metal that would spill out and levitate and do all that strange stuff? Well, they wanted that. They wanted everything. Did anyone who else touched it? I had to give them a list of names and all the rest." So it was a very high-end, high-level talk going on about this metal. So when you have that story come up in 2009 about how nitinol was this kind of low-performing metal that gets supercharged right around the time of the Roswell crash, that's the key aspect that brings us into Monica Reyes's Mondeloy. Remember her patent now. She was the sole person after her partner, scientific partner, died. She was the sole person to own that patent. Keep that in mind. And I promise you there's a big blockbuster on the second half of that tonight. And this all goes directly, again, because McCaslin was in charge of the Roswell crash. That comes directly out of the WikiLeaks Podesta email. So those are the people who knew those things. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep, deep in here tonight, we're getting a handle and a hint of what some of this missing material is all about. Now we're going to go into the occult aspect of it. There was a lot to address. X-Series 224, Occult Aerospace Ritual, NASA, JPL 666, Caltech, the UFO file. What do you got there, Miss Olivia?
Julie Sunshine wants to know, how do they shape or use the memory metal if it cannot be cut?
I think they took decades to figure out how to redevelop this. And, why this should be common knowledge and why like the Atlantic and stuff should know about this. Robert Sarbarker, physicist on record, we've reported many times in this program, said the UFO file was, and he's a celebrated physicist. He said it was a higher level secrecy wise than the nuclear weapons. Well, what is the other thing he said? He said, "Oh yeah, we definitely try to redevelop the crash. We did crash retrievals. And also the beings that were inside, we felt that somebody had constructed insect-like beings to deal with the tremendous speed changes and things like that in the craft. So they were thinking somebody made the beings and that the beings were insect-like." That's the top physicist in the 1950s. Best friends with T.T. Brown, and T.T. Brown in the heart of all that, doing, starting NICAP and all the rest. So you know that if you start to connect up those dots, you start to see, oh, they've been redeveloping and working on those beings or whatever they were and the craft for decades. So when you get into a situation like this where they're saying, oh, Trump is saying, I'm going to put it out. I'm going to put out the UFO files. Look, I'm going to tell you something about things that come from government. And I want you to keep this in mind and take it to the bank. Anyone from the government who says UFO files doesn't know what they're talking about or is obfuscating. The UFO material is in something called the UFO file. It's not UFO files. It is the UFO file. That's how they refer to it on the inside. And it encompasses all of this different aspect, including the X technology, the things that Nikola Tesla is working on, and the whole apotheum effect that we've described in this program. That type of breakaway physics, that's the UFO file. Not a bunch of files of, oh, hey, look, they chased lights in 1958. Well, that's interesting, but that's not really what we're talking about, is it? So I want you to keep that and take it to the bank. And I'll tell you the person who went on the record, and he was in this interview. He was in a heated interview, and he was the CIA director under the first Trump administration. And he's sitting there talking, and he said, they're pressing him, why don't you release the JFK records? Because they still hadn't done that. And he's sitting there and he says, well, it's not an important thing to do. And then he goes, by the way, I've seen the UFO file also. When they say file without the plural, they're on the inside. When they don't say it, if they say files, that's just, hey, we're going to look through a bunch of flight reports from pilots, right? That's not the same thing at all. The UFO file is the highest secret inside the government, the United States government. And if you go to Russia, you're going to find their program is a damn close second. And we don't know enough about their program, but certainly it's right up there. So you have to keep those things in mind when you're dealing with all this. All right, before I get to Parsons, what else have you got?
Following up on the memory metal. So the Buddhas of Boston Sports says the metal can be cut when it's soft. They shape it, then heat treat it, and then return to the shape when it is heated or cooled. I used to be a tool maker and had made fixtures for it. I even have a few strips that stuck to my pocket.
Interesting. And you think that was the original memory metal that we're talking about? That's interesting. Yeah, maybe if you have a story like that, email me at admin@darkjournalist.com. I would love to hear more about that, in fact. Okay, so I did an entire episode. I did 3 episodes.
Sorry, following up?
Yeah.
It's nitinol.
Oh, nitinol. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, nitinol, I believe, is the metal that they piggybacked the memory metal into. And I know it was used, someone wrote to me and told me all the fantastic medical uses. And I went and found a 1978 medical journal talking about the wonders of nitinol. And of course, it has this incredible bendable quality. As a matter of fact, even those sunglasses that bend around your head, all that comes directly out of nitinol. So very flexible indeed. So I've done episodes on CROWLEY and Parsons and Hubbard and their respective wives, lovers, and others. I want to mention that I have a mini series of episodes coming up that deal with a very unusual aspect around those groups. So right in between those two. What I want to focus on tonight is what their relationship to the space program aspect and the rocketry fascination is about. Their individual bios run deep, and I'm always excited to go into their bios. When I read things like Aleister Crowley, as it said, in the UK, here's the thing. Whenever I'm around mystical types of topics, you could say that when I'm absorbing, say, this Rudolf Steiner work, which I've been reading since I was a kid, really, I always emulated the work. I always wanted to be a part of the mystery traditions, you could say, the mystery schools and the information that's coming down. When you get around Crowley's work, you're getting the level of mystery school secret society work, but it has a much different feeling to it. And the feeling is what they want to use it for. You can't deny that the guy was a genius or that he was connected in this remarkable way to magical properties and things. He was a genius black magician. Now, there were people around him who said, oh, yeah, you know, he had these sides to him, but he wasn't like a Satanist, for example, like some of these other characters that came later. And one of the most interesting things I've ever run across on Aleister Crowley is a book by C.S. Knott, who was a Gurdjieff student. And Gurdjieff, of course, encountered Crowley because Crowley went directly to his Chateau de Prayer there in France and the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. And Gurdjieff booted him out of there. He's like, oh, you know, you're addicted to heroin. It's not going to work. But what's interesting is in that book, Knott works for Crowley in a bookstore in the 1930s, and he's also a student of Gurdjieff. And I found this incredible crossover between Gurdjieff and Crowley's students, each one trying to get something at the feet of the master, you know, in this case. Or in the case of Crowley, the feet of the black magician master. And it's interesting because he said, oh, you know, when I worked for Crowley, he was just my boss at the bookstore. And, you know, he was an ordinary guy who would complain about the weather and politics and all this kind of stuff. And then he said he always had these big ideas. And he said, I'm going to create this incredible arena where we're going to do these rituals and all this kind of stuff. And Knott was talking to him in the bookstore, and he was like, you have the money to do that? You know, I'd like to be a part of this whole movement and everything else. And Crowley turned to him and said, no, I don't have a farthing. So, you know, it's weird. We know that Crowley inherited all this money, and that's what was part of his nihilistic trip. But here he is as this average guy, and he said, you know, Gurdjieff was always very abrupt, trying to get results out of me. He's like, Crowley was more fatherly. Can you imagine having Crowley as a father image? So the C.S. Knott book's interesting because, you know, there are odds sides here with Crowley that don't add up to the big Satanist image that is put out there with him. That's weird. He was a mountain climber. I put that in the episode that I did on him, and I went into great detail. So keep that in mind that there's, you know, there's sides going on here. It's like one side against the other, one bad eye against the other side. But in 1904, he writes his Book of the Law, and that really, you know, puts all these people in his orbit. Matter of fact, when he's writing these books in 1915 or 1916, I think, the head of the Scottish Rite, you know, gets in touch with him and says, you know, I have to initiate you into the Masonic rites because you gave away the big Masonic secret on page 171 of your book. And is some kind of sex ritual there that supposedly is a big Masonic secret. That's another episode, but, you know, these groups overlapping is very strange. And when you get to the mystery schools versus kind of secret society activity, so the groups that study the right path, and there's the groups that study the left path being more of a dark path, then you're getting into two different, very different types of groups using the same type of knowledge, elevated information. So I'm going to try to insert this 666 part and then go to how it works with Parsons and Aerojet. Let's see if I can pull that up. All right, so this is Rudolf Steiner. And like I said, a totally different frequency on this. From his lecture, Three Streams of Human Evolution. And he talks about, these different periods of time where humanity was developing after the Atlantean catastrophe into Egypt and all the rest. And he starts to get into the time of Christ, and he calls it the mystery of Golgotha. And Golgotha, of course, is translated as the place of the skull. This is where they crucified Christ. Now, what's interesting is he starts talking about why this 666 aspect is important. Now, 666 was at the heart of the CROWLEY work, and this whole thing about the beast and all this. And he came out of a very Christian, Victorian Christian upbringing with the headmasters who would smack him with the ruler and all that. So he hated all that, and he wanted to be the epitome of the opposite. But it's the crux of his kind of magical aspect. And then, if you're not particularly Christian growing up, you'll hear about this 666 thing and Mark of the Beast and think, oh, that's, heavy duty Bible thumper, like over the top. But it comes directly out of Revelation. So there's a whole numerological aspect, there's a warning aspect, and then there's also an aspect that is sought out in the mystery schools about those numbers when you get them, because 1998 was a combination of those numbers, and we are supposed to be in this wave of 1998, this test period that goes on for a century. So 1998 is 666 times 3. So keep that in mind with some of the weird numerology that Steiner uses here. And he's talking a lot about how people look at things and how we can't be superficial and not to be superficial when dealing with these things. And he starts talking about what people think of as ghosts, demons, and things of that nature. So I'm going to try to cut to the quick with this, but we'll go as we go. Okay. So what he has to say here, it is indeed true that if we go back to the time before and after the mystery of Golgotha, or further back into the third post-Atlantean culture epoch, we find that people, for the most part, believed in ghosts, believed in demons. As I mentioned recently, in the case of the great Tertullian, this is indeed so. But there's still an earlier epoch when men also talked of ghosts, but not in the sense that ghosts were believed in during the epochs just described. In the second and in the first post-Atlantean cultures, they spoke of ghosts, but they were conscious that the ghosts were visualized by their own mind and were pictures of the spiritual world existing behind them. Thus, for a long period, men had a conception of ghosts, but with the knowledge that behind the ghosts, seen as pictures, there was a spiritual world. In their conceptual world, with its ghost-like visualizations, they formed an image of the spiritual world, but then men more or less forgot the spiritual world, and perhaps we might say it disappeared from their vision. There remained mere pictures, which were looked upon as realities, and from this there arose the superstition about ghosts, which is the debased forms of those earlier beliefs. Now, I mention this because there's a whole thing about specters around all of this, and this relates directly to what happens when the mystery groups or the secret societies become obsessed with space. And there's this whole thing about space ghosts, for example. But in the heart of the Steiner literature, as we've done so many shows on Steiner and his great looking out over the Ahrimanic powers that were seizing the 21st century and trying to spin humanity's spiritual evolution in their direction. Are you going to go my way? And creating the eighth sphere to suck in all of humanity's genius and all the rest. And the eighth sphere being a kind of a gigantic virtual reality realm, which seems like, you're making progress and on the course. And what's happening little by little is you're being cut off from your own spirituality. And so at the heart of that, in Steiner's cosmology, he's saying, look, you have this dark astral force called Ahriman, and what it's doing is it literally seeks to take humanity off of its spiritual evolutionary path, where we develop this whole new Jerusalem, which is the new Jupiter and all these things. And that's the new Jerusalem and the 144,000 souls that get lifted up to that. That whole thing that comes out of Revelation from John at Patmos, that is a vision of humanity's spiritual evolution. This thing, wants to lock humanity into a cycle of coarseness and materiality. And that's where the whole harmonic eighth sphere activity comes from. It's going to help us to understand that when I get to the punchline around 666 here. To keep that in mind as we go. And I always recommend an outline of esoteric science. And sometimes it's called an outline of occult science. They have different titles for it, but it's out there. And this is probably, that and Cosmic Memory are probably the two opus books on the Steiner side. So he's going into how we're sinking, you know, in that era. Now he's talking 1920, how we're sinking into this kind of non-spiritual vision and going into this technology vision. And he's talking about what would have happened in the year 666 if Christ had not come. And what he says, what would have happened instead of predicting this gigantic disaster is this harmonic force would have given us incredible knowledge and information that we would have basically destroyed ourselves with. So this is the nature of the problem, that part of this, the secret behind the 666 beast mythology, you know, mark of the beast, is the technology overtaking us. And then we fall into the realm of Arma. That's the way that Steiner describes it. And so he goes into this whole thing about the consciousness soul. I'll spare us that, but he's talking about forming conceptions of ghosts and things. And so what he has something here is, it's terrible how in these days men are willing only to question nature, and of nature they can only know its ghost. Hence, the reality becomes oppressively active in the unconscious, demanding entrance into the consciousness, for we live in the epoch of the consciousness soul. Thus, I have made clear to you something important in the situation we're facing today, which I have led you to see how it is that men form ghostly conceptions of nature, while scientific experimenters are found on all sides. Then a man in his reality appears before them, and the scientists study him, but the ghostly concepts of natural science are inadequate for this. Hence, the scientists are observers not of man, but only of his ghost. Psychoanalysts. Psychoanalysis is the unmistakable child of a ghostly natural science. Thus, I always speak of psychoanalysis as working with inadequate means. Now, as a consequence of all that goes with these streams, human evolution as a whole came to an important crossroads at a certain definite year. During this year, the three streams flowed together into a critical conjunction which was concealed only by a confusion in outer conditions, so that only the confusion was seen, but not what was actually happening. The critical point occurred 666 years after the mystery of Golgotha, the Christ crucifixion. At that time, 666 years after the birth of Christ, something was due to happen that could have happened, but did not happen. The reason why it did not happen, you will now hear. And keep in mind 666 as the core of the secret societies of the left-hand schools. In the year 666, there could have come visibly for ordinary people, particularly for men of the West, an important being who would not have entered the physical plane, but would have made himself very clearly perceptible to mankind, even in an external way. So think about this. You're not seeing him physically, but whatever it is, you can see it. Maybe you see it as an apparition, but it's going to be visible for ordinary people. Had this being appeared in the form he intended, we should not be writing 1918 today, but 1918 minus 666, or 1252. In other words, this being would have come in 666, made such an impact that we would have marked time from there instead of from the time of Christ. For this being would have inspired men in such a way that they would have regulated their chronology accordingly. Had he been able to appear according to plan, this being would have brought forward about something very, very strange. Now, the matter is like this. 333 years earlier, or 330 years after Christ, we have exactly the middle of the fourth post-Atlantean period. the middle, that is, of the Greco-Latin epoch. And then he does all this strange math here to figure out the epochs and all the rest of it. And then he says, when you take away 747, you have 333. So that year, 333 of our era that we understand is 333 AD, was the middle of the Greco-Roman period, epoch. It was not before the mystery of Golgotha, as this is the midpoint, but after. It signifies the highest possible reality, but not an external reality, because in external reality, the two other streams flow in. If, however, evolution had proceeded in a straight line without the side streams flowing in, then 747 would have been the true center, and it would have been the zenith or the impact of the intellectual or mind soul. The intellectual mind soul would have then reached the highest degree of external development. But it did not come about like that, because in a certain sense, the serpent was already at work, having planned to apply in 666, 333 years later, a quite definite procedure into human evolution. The intention of this being the Sorat, the beast, this is Ahriman and his hordes, who had fully developed the consciousness soul, whereas man had only reached the age of intellectual or mind soul, was to bestow prematurely on men all the soul's spiritual achievements unobtainable through the intellectual or soul mind and within the reach of the consciousness soul. In effect, the culture epoch of the consciousness soul was to come prematurely to man. According to world conditions, 666 was the most favorable point in time for this. The Sorat would then have been able to exercise such influence upon the earth that he could have said, I am now teaching men everything they will ever be able to gain through consciousness. Little by little, I am pouring into man now in this epoch of the mind soul all that the other gods who I oppose wish to give him in the next cultural epoch, when he'd be ready for it. An unjustified mingling of intellectual mind soul with the consciousness soul was the object of view. And in the heart of it all is the access to technology, so that anything that you could conceive of doing, you could do. That's the kind of Frankenstein that was being set up. So what Steiner is giving us the key to this kind of numerology that's coming directly out of this psycho-spiritual tradition, religions, and others. Why is 666 so important? There's a great secret in the heart of it. And when we open up the CROWLEY Parsons work and what they were after, we can see Steiner is exactly right. We'll get into that next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, you know you're going deep. It's deep territory. X-Series 224, Occult, Aerospace, Ritual, NASA JPL 666, Caltech, and the UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions here. I'm running late here with the question part, but say in about 10 minutes or so, we'll take questions. How's that? Okay. But in the meantime,
Lamby Lambowski says carbon, the building block of life, is a cube and has 6 electrons, 6 protons, and 6 neutrons. 666.
Oh, that's fascinating. There's obviously, you know, if there's one set of numbers, that's probably the most popular number string in popular imagination. You know, much more than some kind of E equals MC square type thing. It's the 666. It's put there for a reason. And it's put in a very religious context. That's the number of evil. That's the beast and all the rest of it. And yet here's Steiner going behind the mask and saying there's a reason why. Because there are forces at work in the evolution of humanity's possible development. And they're coming in from different sides. And when you see kind of loosey-goosey stuff out there about Enoch or Nephilim, you have to understand those are deep, very deep concepts. You can't flow that out there, you know, as we see a lot of people in the space doing that, being like, oh yeah, like Nephilim, whatever, you know. It's a study that you'd have to embark upon for a while with a very open spiritual edge to you. You couldn't be distracted by phones and laptops and things if you really want to get that one. And so this is crucial, I'd say, just in general for us to figure out. So what we're going to do is move into the aspect. Oh, by the way, that is the Steiner. I love the Steiner blackboard drawings. They bring back all these memories and impressions of when I was first looking at them. But here is the aiming for the head that takes place through the harmonic forces. And there's the person's head. And here we have a very important aspect for these forces that Steiner is describing. They have to win the head. They have to win over your thinking. So this is the kind of game that goes on in the invisible realms. Back there in early development of the space program, you've got some very, very important characters. And we've talked at length about different people like Werner von Braun, and we've seen von Braun predict coming of the Elon who's going to take over Mars. And then we have this Elon Musk who wants to bring consciousness to Mars because he's the only one who can do it, don't you know? And all the weird kind of contradictions of Elon Musk and this bizarroness. But back there in the heart of it is this figure that I did a really in-depth episode on called George Ellery Hale, who I like to bring up from time to time, especially when Caltech comes up, because I believe that Caltech has a rich, mystical, esoteric history to go along with the making of rockets and all the rest of it. But in George Ellery Hale's case, he was obsessed with Akhenaten. Akhenaten the pharaoh, who was the father of Tutankhamun and who believed in the Aten. He creates a one god environment in the middle of this Egyptians worshiping 296. And he said, no, it's all about the Aten sun disk. And I'm in touch with him. I'm his representative on Earth. And then we have all these unusual images of Akhenaten looking like, what would you say, something not quite human. I mean, he's human, all right, but he has a mystical look to him. He looks like some kind of a hybrid, I would say, or a different type of advancing being. One of the things that Hale did, and he had his trips to Egypt, and he sought out all this information about Akhenaten, and he would have long periods where he would have to, take time out for a month or whatever, and he would be obsessed with all this Egyptian imagery. And Hale, by the way, would go on to be one of the greatest scientists and create the Palomar laboratory and all these different aspects. This is what he erected over the door. Oh, it's not coming out so well. I'll post this because it's just showing up white. Isn't that interesting? It must be the light bouncing off of it. I'm going to post this, but what it is basically is this incredible image of the sun disk. And you can describe it there.
Yeah, with all these rays coming down off of it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I should have.
It's interesting enough, the sun, rather than being round, at least from this angle, is more oval, almost like an eye.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Then on the side, there are hieroglyphics.
Yes, those are interesting also. The Egyptian fascination is there, and the whole reason he wants to do the most incredible telescope is because he wants to track these astronomical movements that he thinks relate directly to ancient Egyptian mythology and things of this nature. Possibly even a belief in Osiris, but certainly a fascination there. Now, coming through Caltech also was a very mysterious character previous to Jack Parsons. And his name was George Hodel, and he ran these incredible occult circles, and then later would become a murder suspect in the Black Dahlia case, and would get off on that charges. But his son would put out a number, who became a policeman, would put out a number of books and things claiming that his dad was a serial occult murderer. And Hodel came right through Caltech, and they thought, oh, this guy's a genius, So he's just one of those other weird visitors that goes through that has this occult signature going on.
That is one of my favorite episodes that you've ever done.
Oh yes,
And
absolutely.
I
Black
still-
Dahlia.
it haunts me actually.
It's got Man Ray. It's got John Huston, the director. It's got Lolita.
Well, you're dealing with LA.
Yes.
Occult LA.
Exactly.
We still have today.
Yeah.
And you just wonder.
And he's a doctor.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And hidden rooms
Oh, right.
and all of that. Mhm.
So there's a little setup here for Parsons, because I want to get the background on the Golden Dawn here. We've done many episodes on Golden Dawn, and I don't want to suggest the Golden Dawn as any kind of evil order or anything like that. The Golden Dawn petered out, at a certain period, but it was attracting all these poets and musicians and people like that. And it's very interesting when you think about the series that we do here, which is the X-steganography series, all comes from this Johannes Trithemius talking about, he's this abbot in Germany in the 14th century, and he is having these he figures out this incredible thing about magical visions with angels and all this stuff. But he realizes if he writes it down, the church is going to have a big issue with him. So he writes it all in steganography, which he said he learned from the ancient Greeks, and that the term literally means a page within a page. And I've used steganography in a variety of ways to formulate the basis for the show that we do here with you now. But one of the things that was going on there in the background is that when this figure who founds the Golden Dawn rolls into what is basically an antique shop, he finds a scroll, which is the same scroll written in the steganography of this Johannes Trithemius all the way back there. And it is the key to all the Golden Dawn rituals and everything else. And it's associated with the Rosicrucians in Germany, and there's a lot of mystery school history that goes on here. But it should be known that the Golden Dawn, the foundation of the Golden Dawn, comes directly out of this kind of secret chiefs of the Rosicrucians type thing, and is not, it becomes because CROWLEY as a young man has a power struggle when he gets in that organization, tries to take it over a cliff. But Golden Dawn itself isn't really, it doesn't have that kind of nasty occult signature that it would be given with CROWLEY. Now, the most influential effort occurred through the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a British-based initiatory group whose innovations was matched only by factional disputes and friction amongst its leaders, which in turn precipitated still newer forms of occultism. The traceable history of the Golden Dawn began in the fall of 1887 when London coroner and Freemason William Wynne Westcott, 1848 to 1925, came into the possession of a folio of alchemical symbols and encrypted ritualist writings in English, French, Latin, and Hebrew. And this was the scroll of steganography from Trithemius. That's where the whole thing came out of. The 60-leaf folio was accompanied by a sheet with the name and address of a mysterious and possibly invented German countess whom the bearer could contact for guidance. And what happens is this Mathers character comes on the scene who's a genius, and he translates. He's been translating all these books like the Hermetica and things like that, and he translates these. And then he is in contact with these secret chiefs, and he's heading up the Golden Dawn. And it's a young CROWLEY that comes up and tries to take over. And it's kind of like magician versus magician. And the Golden Dawn gradually fades from that type of infighting. That's the milieu that CROWLEY is coming out of. And it operates on this level. And it's very interesting because where people would associate CROWLEY with all the dark arts and things like that, he himself, he thinks he's doing this great thing for humanity. He's bringing in the new Aeon of Horus and all the rest of it. And he thinks it's a new age, and he's the head of it. And it's what I get a lot of when I see these groups coming up in that period, like THELEMA, Golden Dawn, and all this stuff. I get that it's like an early version of the 60s because the 60s had drugs and free love and all these other things that came up, ecstatic ritual through the music. And um, that's what these people are there. They're already there mentally. They already want that reality, but it's not there yet. It's not available in the culture. So they're kind of like weird outposts doing this, and some darker than others for sure. But of course, you get some light and dark in the 60s as well. So we have this fantastic character, Jack Parsons, and he is a rocketry genius coming through Caltech. Families from Massachusetts, wealthy. And then they come to California. They put him in Caltech. He's an early genius on this. He's contacting German scientists over in Germany who are fascinated with rocketry, and they're in touch with each other, including von Braun and our friend Parsons. This is quite a remarkable thing for a young man in that era.
So
yes.
what is the time period here? In the
1925, 1926. And, but it is really the 30s and 40s where he gets really rolling. Now, I'm going to jump ahead and jump back with him. At a certain point, he is doing these rituals to draw in this elemental character, this woman who can help him pull off these rituals that he wants to do. And this woman shows up out of nowhere. Now, Marjorie Cameron is very interesting. She would be known as the Witch of LA later. But in this period, guess what she is, Miss Olivia? She is the secretary to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yeah. So she is from a very high military branch, and she just said, I had this incredible urge to come over here and meet you. And they become this incredible item and do all this magical working together. In the meantime, the FBI has been keeping their eye on Parsons and his THELEMA attitude. This, by the way, is her picture of him. Look at that.
Wow. Well, it's a beautiful picture.
It is. And she calls him Dark Angel.
It's proto-goth.
Whoa. I mean, just take a look at this thing. So, Cameron is remarkable in this sense that she kind of wants to go further even than him. And they're both kind of feeding off each other in this weird mystical haze that, they can go into these ecstatic states and meet these beings and all the rest of it. Now,
wait, how are they doing that?
Well, they do it through the rituals, and
are they
there's
taking drugs?
Yeah, they take drugs.
Do you know what drugs they were taking?
They have sex rituals.
Yes.
There's a number of things that go on there. But one of the things I want to say is she, before she meets him, sees a UFO, and she will regularly see orbs. She's reporting that in 1946. That's a year before we get the incredible sightings of Kenneth Arnold and the UFO breakthrough and all the rest of it. And Chris Bledsoe, eat your heart out. Yeah, other people saw orbs before you did. And people in the know realize that whenever there's an orb sighting, representatives of the Bledsoe family come out and like, we have the copyright on seeing orbs. Something very, very strange about what happened is a kind of looked like an innocent UFO story turned into very, very bizarre land. But there she is having UFO sightings and telling him about it and him writing about it in his journal. So it's on the record. And I'll say this too about something else presaging the whole field of UFO world, which is, George Adamski, who is the early contactee, and he meets Orthon and all that stuff. He is photographing UFOs in the 1940s, really before anybody else. So there is something going on there with Adamski, although he will become kind of the punchline of the contactee aspect. One of the people who is around now, and I will round this all out nicely for us with a lot of questions, by the way. One of the people who's around this, the whole development of Parsons and his genius rocketry part of these people would be known as the Suicide Squad. They would be the dynamic people in the background who are really cutting edge coming out of Caltech and now working as government contractors and others. One of those people is Roger Molina, who I've touched on in an episode going back now 4 years. And one of my favorite strange episodes or people to look into. American physicist, astronomer, and distinguished professor of arts and technology. After all this is over and after he's exposed to all these deep state activities, and by the way, you know how I talk about the Torbett document on here, which is all about, you know, the space program's involvement with the death of President Kennedy. Roger Molina is right in the heart of all that. Somehow he's in the middle of the Torbett document. Now, it's interesting because...
Could you go into that a little?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it's Frank Molina is the one. I'm sorry, Roger is the son, and that's who I'm going to link this whole thing up to. So it's Frank Molina, and Frank Molina is partners with Parsons and all this, and Roger is his son. And what's going on here is that Frank Molina, after coming out of all this rocketry stuff, goes into deep state work for the government and then shows up in the heart of the Torbett document, where Torbett's talking about, you know, the space program and how it relates to the assassination of President Kennedy. Torbett document being like the WikiLeaks of 1970 version, and just hangs out there. People still don't know what to make of it, or of its core claim that Defense Industrial Security Command is run by these paperclip Nazis and they manage the UFO file. And the acronym for Defense Industrial Security Command is DISC. Can't get much better than that. But Roger Molina is his son, and I will jump ahead here for a moment because there's something very strange about Roger Molina. And what's interesting for me about him is the person that he marries in the heart of all this is Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Christine. Now, you can see the overarching from the 1930s and 40s development straight on through to the weirdness that takes place with Epstein and Maxwell. How does that work? Well, he's out of MIT, isn't he? Christine Maxwell has been his spouse. They have 3 children. Father is Frank Molina. Frank Molina partners with Jack Parsons all the way back there in the Caltech days, goes deep state, and somehow shows up in relation to the Kennedy assassination. Well, Molina married British internet content pioneer and educator Christine Maxwell. They have 3 children, and one of them's named Xavier, for you ex-steganography fans. I've got a big X connection coming up here in a moment, but I want us to settle in on this for a moment. So part of the Suicide Squad, this Frank Molina character, and then Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons at that point is taking over THELEMA, and CROWLEY is saying he's the one who's going to be my successor. CROWLEY is sending him all of this information. They're corresponding through letters and things. And CROWLEY is in the UK, he's in New York, and back and forth. I also tracked him setting up a OTO lodge in Detroit, by the way, which you don't hear often about CROWLEY in Detroit, but there he is. And so what we have here is a very interesting crossover with Parsons and his incredible relationship going on with CROWLEY and this Marjorie Cameron woman. Enter L. Ron Hubbard in the heart of it. So encapsulated Scientology shows up in the heart of this. And one of the things that goes on here is Parsons, if I back up a little bit, he has a wife. She's very disenchanted with him. He takes up with his wife's sister, who is 17. And, you know, the wife cuts out of there and he's with this woman. And then out of nowhere, our friend, it seems like he attracts very interesting people. Our friend L. Ron Hubbard shows up at Parsons' place and says, I want to have a room. I hear you have a room to let. I'd love to stay there.
He just shows up out of the blue.
No background at all with them. And Hubbard also is interesting. He's already written a number of science fiction books at this point. And by the way, he will become one of the most prolific authors of science fiction of anybody, anywhere, the amount of books that he's written. So by the time he gets to Scientology and crafting a religion out of his scientific ideas or fantasies, he's already written, hundreds of books. And he's a very interesting character. Of course, we've gotten into him in a few episodes, and I won't linger on him too long here. But what's significant is this. Instantly, when he comes on the scene, it's CROWLEY sending these messages over to Parsons and saying, look, this guy, it sounds like a confidence game, and you're the sucker. And he says, and if you look at those letters, the greatest thing, and I always quote it, he says, this guy, I don't trust that. He doesn't have good morals. So when you're getting called out on your morals by Aleister Crowley, you get problems. You have to look at it like from a totally weird perspective that somehow it's Crowley picking up on this guy doing it. And he does a number on Parsons. First off, he steals his, his paramour there and takes off with her. And then he steals the money that they were going to go into business together, getting these ships and all this stuff. He takes off with the wife and the money, and he buys this yacht. And then what's interesting is Parsons does this magical incantation that the yacht runs into this storm and they have to come back. And they're like, oh my God, he is a black magician. He made all this stuff happen. And he takes them to court, and Parsons says, look, I'll settle up with you. I don't have any of the money left now, but here's $2,000 for your trouble. And so all of this stuff is in a whirl, and in the heart of it, the FBI is looking a deep, deep look at Parsons and taking a deep look at his companions here. Now, what I feel is going on in this period, because he's been involved with rocket work and been involved with the space program, the early developing rudiments of the space program through rocketry, and really working for some of the top, and I mean the top companies. He is somebody now, Parsons, who is a leading investor, company, employee, part owner of Aerojet. Now, Aerojet was one of the biggest cutting edge companies in the 1940s. They were setting up for jet rockets and all the rest of it. They were the ones to go to for this stuff. And it's very interesting because if you look at a company coming down the pike a little bit later, you're going to find Aerojet Rocketdyne. Now, Aerojet is the company that Molina and our friend Parsons set up, and that eventually, because they find out about THELEMA and all this stuff, they throw him off the board or whatever. But guess who works for Aerojet Rocketdyne later on? Monica Reza. Monica Reza, she of the memory metal patent. We're starting to jibe here a little bit. So Aerojet is the exact same company that comes out of the Caltech Occult system that develops this incredible technology in the 1940s. And then in the heart of it, we have this character Parsons. Later on, we're going to have the person who's redeveloping the Roswell metal, and she's working for Aerojet Rocketdyne. Now we're syncing up a little bit. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Now, in the background here around Aerojet, there's just a few anecdotes about his life and what he's doing back here. And they're taking a snapshot of his life in this period where he's building up Aerojet. And it says, although there were arguments among the commune members, Parson remained dedicated to THELEMA. He gave almost all of his salary to OTO while actively seeking out new members, recruiting JPL mathematician Barbara Canwright, and financially supported Aleister Crowley in London. Okay, so Parsons has Aerojet and he's sending the money to Crowley. Parsons' enthusiasm for the lodge quickly began to impact his professional life. He frequently appeared at Aerojet hungover and sleep deprived from late nights of lodge activities, and invited many of his colleagues to them drawing the ire of staff who previously tolerated Parsons' occultism as harmless eccentricity, known to von Karman as a delightful screwball. Von Karman also is part of that original team that starts off with Parsons, and he, of course, is one of the most famous rocket scientists of all time. He was frequently observed reciting Crowley's poem, Hymn to Pan, in an ecstatic manner compared to the preaching of Billy Graham during rocket tests. So he's preaching loud as they're doing the tests, all of the incantations to Pan. Parsons became more rigorously engaged in Aerojet's day-to-day business in an effort to resolve the wariness. But the Agape Lodge soon came under investigation by the Pasadena Police Department and the FBI. Okay, so this is a spin-off of THELEMA that he's running in the heart there, and they're starting to see them. They're like, oh, they're painting their bodies. Late at night, they're doing nude rituals. They're doing all this stuff. The police department, the FBI, everyone's all over them at this point. Again, it's like, you know, we're talking about the mid-40s, World War II. Both have received allegations of a black magic cult involved with sexual orgies. Lodge members and ritual involving a naked pregnant woman jumping through fire. And Parsons explained that the lodge was simply an organization dedicated to religious and philosophical speculation, in his words. Neither agency found evidence of illegal activity and came to the conclusion that the lodge constituted no threat to national security. I want to point out this pattern over and over again with Parsons, which is this. He gets into trouble. He goes up before the courts. He gets off. He gets into trouble. It's espionage. He's a communist. Whatever they charge him with, he gets off. How many times does that happen? It's this bizarre pattern in his life. And ultimately, he never gets into trouble for anything, really. Having been a long-term heavy user of alcohol and marijuana, Parsons now habitually used cocaine, amphetamines, peyote, mescaline, and opiates as well. You asked about the drugs. There's the list. And so he's going into kind of a tailspin here. And by the way, before that tailspin is over, he will become a professional witness in explosion cases. And he will take a job basically as a groundskeeper to have an apartment. So things have really gone to heck for him by then. However, there's an interesting little sideswipe in the heart of all this, which I'm going to get to. And before I do, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
This is crazy.
Yes.
So I don't even know where to start here. Don Devine says it does seem to be a Jedi versus the Sith kind of thing, the history, Jacques de Molay, and what the left love to do is lie, left-hand magic, that is, Lord of Lies kind of thing.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about kind of the left-hand mystery schools?
Well, I mean, they hold the excess of the political power. And it's interesting because the people who told us about them, really, Blavatsky and Steiner, gave us the hint that this is what's going on. So we're supposed to know that the mystery schools on one leg and the secret societies on the other are dominating the situation. The question is, what is it? What's the outcome that's going to take place here? There's a balance going on between the two. I take it directly back to X-Protect and X-Share, which I've outlined on the show a number of times. We have to keep that X-Protect aspect in mind, because I think the X-Protect group comes directly with an overhang of occult, and that's where you get the Men in Black and that whole piece of it. And remember that's the astral agency that's doing that. They're using astral powers to do it. And by the way, Cameron, when she talked about Parsons, would say he's one of the best people doing astral projection that she's ever run across. So
does she give examples?
She just literally talks about how great he is at that. He can project himself anywhere.
Wow.
So think about that in terms of abilities. Yeah. that's something else. Yes. What else?
So where do you think they are doing these things? I mean, I immediately had to go to CERN in my mind, but like this is obviously elite high tech, right? And doing secret occult rituals or even open occult rituals. Where's the legacy?
Well, certainly if you track it, it gets very interesting, because in my mind, it goes directly from what was set up as the Orphic Circle that Emma Britton was a part of. And she describes the group as the people leading the British government. So Benjamin Disraeli is there before he's the prime minister, and Charles Dickens is there. So the glitterati of all of these different aspects are there at the Orphic Circle. And she is a 12 to 13 to 14-year-old girl during this period of time, and they are using her as a channel to get all of this information on the psychic side, but getting state secrets and the nature of reality, all kinds of things. And it's very interesting because that whole thing with the whole seance craze and the mysticism, the spiritualism that takes hold in the 19th century gets reborn in the Macy conferences of the 1940s, but their object is through technology to build a cyborg and have consciousness inside of it. Now, when you see people like Elon Musk, for example, touting Neuralink, originally he said, oh, this is, so people who've had some disability can really come back to full control over their body. Later, he changed it and said anyone can opt in and get this chip in their head. So he started to change it. And then 10,000 people signed up because they wanted to augment their brain with one of these chips. Look, there's a guy, a scientist over here at Harvard who got caught, Lieberman, and he was doing Chinese espionage, but it was on brain-machine interface. Now he shows up, this story just came out today, that he shows up in a lab in China, and he is, under his care now are these 2,000 primates, and he's doing these brain chip things. And he's like, this is going to be the most incredible thing for humanity. And their whole focus in China is all about this brain interface thing. That is the threshold. And when you get to that point, talk about the beast and everything else. It's Charles Liebler is the guy, and he was sentenced to 3 years in jail. I don't know what the deal was there. It seems to me like that kind of espionage that he was doing. And he did it right here at Harvard. The interesting thing for me is for him to reemerge, that any company would want him as a PR face of anything is remarkable. But the work that he was talking about doing, and then the primates that they work on and all these different things that they're doing, we have to understand it's a different world. Like, it's a completely kind of psychotic arrangement on the levels that the transhumanists are thinking, which is why the people like Peter Thiel are so dangerous, and why if they come into something like the UFO field, talking about alien gods and the Antichrist, it has to be roundly rejected. And how, people can't be working for Peter Thiel and trying to get UFO truth. It does not work. If I was working for Peter Thiel, I would go immediately to St. Patrick's Cathedral and, pray to God to cleanse my soul. And then I'd go to a Native American sage tent and for a month and get my aura cleansed from all that. I mean, you can't imagine the kind of dross that's involved with people, the kind of toxic transhumanist aspects. And it's interesting because, at different times in my life, I've been around those high finance people, and they regard other fellow human beings as ants. That's literally how one of them described people to me. And I remember I took it to heart. And the guy at the time was trying to get me to meet Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Remember, she of the Supreme Court. And I was just thinking, the level that these people think on, they think the general mass of humanity is just so below them, and all the stuff that they do over here. They're in a kind of psychotic frenzy, I guess you could call it. And, so when you get around the transhumanists, this whole thing needs to come out. Like the society at large needs to reject the transhumanists, and they need to reject it with Musk. They need to reject it with Thiel. They need to reject it with Liebler and his weird Chinese chips. I feel bad for the primates. They should put a chip on this guy. But this is the nature of the scene, and where all the money has gone in with the billionaires. Every time you turn around, there's another billionaire. This billionaire is running NASA. This billionaire it's imbalanced. And what happens to things when it's imbalanced and they're top heavy, they topple over. And that's what we're in the middle of this cycle over. And as we explore these things, we're looking at forces. And the way I can kind of sum up parts of this episode tonight, and I have a little more to drop on you. But look at it this way, that all the way back there, we have this occult influence through JPL, Caltech, and all the rest. And when you get to the moon, you have people like Buzz Aldrin doing Masonic rituals up there. And there's actually a Masonic lodge for the moon. And you don't even have to think poorly by any stretch of Masons or anything like that. But what is it that's going on in the ritualizing of these things? What is space ritual, space magic? What is it that Crowley is trying to do with the spirits of the air? What is it that he's transmitted down to Parsons? Why is Parsons such a cutting edge space scientist with all of these, feelings towards this kind of Luciferian angling? So you have to put these things together in interesting ways. And when you see that, Aerojet becomes, Rocketdyne, and that's the same company that Monica Reza is working for. And then when you see that Maxwell has married the son of Frank Molina, who's part of that original squad with Parsons, these are the elite crossovers. Some people think about bloodlines. I think of the Aerospace thing as a huge occult club. And that would be my best answer on it. Okay, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Alicia Holborn says in the book Space, Sex, and Rockets, they said that Parsons wanted to be the Antichrist. Is that true? Because I had never heard that.
I have not heard that Parsons wanted to be the Antichrist, but I think that Crowley may have seen himself this way because he so despised the Christian orthodoxy, because he grew up in it. And, like his mother was strict. And he had all these issues from a very early age. And then when his father dies, he gets this incredible inheritance. And then he really cuts loose. He takes off, and he basically becomes a very immoral character. But I think from the very word go, it's a weird thing with him because he's also the head of the chess club at Cambridge. He's like a master chess player, and he has this weird dual timeline life. So I don't think it's very easy to figure out exactly who's operating back there, but these beings show up to him. So he's an exceptional magician. And when he's dealing with these beings, they want to use him to unleash these movements. And he's thinking it's a good thing. It's the new era of Horus, and he's right in the heart of it. But, it's incredibly dark. There's no question about it. Yes.
Tim Houston says, I've never quite understood how JP and LRH's occult rituals would invoke flying saucers. Babylon was an extreme aspect of the goddess, the way I see it, but Marjorie Cameron appeared in JP's life, so I suppose you could say the working worked. And Mighty Josh says, Elon's ex has a tattoo on her leg of the Scarlet Woman, Carson Hubbard workings.
Wow. Well, this is exactly what he wanted, the Scarlet Woman, and he conjured her. And then when she showed up, she was shocked because she was like, everyone around there was expecting me to come. Even her description with her red hair and everything else. So Cameron's very interesting as well. It's interesting you mentioned Sex and Rockets. There's a little background of that here. Let's see. Why did I put that in there? That is... Oh, yeah. It's funny. So someone mentioned the Sex and Rockets book. There's a funny history to this, I'll tell you, which is the publisher called me up, I don't know, 2018, I think. And he said, do you want to cover this book? And I said, yeah, I'll interview the author. And they said, well, he's a secretive aerospace guy. He goes under a different name and all that. And he'll only talk to you if you keep his identity a secret. And I said, sure, absolutely. But he'll be on camera. And so we did this whole back and forth, and it never manifested. But the guy who was the book publisher wanted to do the interview. And I got such a weird vibe from the book publisher when I did the interview that I never published it. But the book itself I found remarkable and full of insight. One of those insights is here, and I think it's what you were referring to. It says, and it's about that pan aspect again, and it says that Parsons loved to recite pagan poetry to the sky while stamping his feet. A reference to Crowley's Hymn to Pan, which Parsons loved to recite at a party at the big house, 10,003 South Orange Grove Avenue, where he would eventually live. Parsons stood on a balcony above the gathering and recited the hymn from memory after being prompted by Andrew Haley, von Karman's attorney. Aerojet employee Fritz Zwicky related to the Parsons and invoked Pan, the wild horde god of fertility, because each rocket test, they were looking for this kind of environment. Parsons was probably not the only one present at such dangerous tests who said a prayer. His heterodoxy notwithstanding, von Karman wrote in 1958 that Parsons was the third most important person in the development of rocketry in the United States. That's von Karman, who is the legend. And behind only himself and Frank Molina. So this group, very important from the outset. So thinking about the things that they're involved in is crucial. Rich talent. Karman said he praised Parsons for his rich talent in chemistry, and perhaps induced by Parsons' belief, von Karman found it necessary to say that he had read John Simon's The Great Beast, an early, somewhat sensational biography of Aleister Crowley, infamous black magician. So again, we're getting into that very interesting contradiction, which is you have basically the top guy in our rocketry program saying he's the third best of all time. Other people say he was the best of all time. And since we're getting on the Roswell train with the memory metal, it's very interesting to note that some of the earliest work that Parsons did was with Robert Goddard, who was getting funded by Guggenheim. And where was he setting off those rockets, Goddard? It was in Roswell, New Mexico. But that was 1932. So it's 15 years before the Roswell crash. How does that work? Give me those answers.
Can we back up for a second here?
Yeah.
I'm just sort of really, I want to understand what the connection is.
Yes.
Why these people who would be interested in rocketry or in technology would be drawn to the occult and specifically sex magic.
Well, that goes back, you see, some of the answers to that are very interesting because Kundalini itself, the Kundalini energy, is also associated with sex magic. And
so is the rocket, I mean, let's face it, is it a phallic symbol? Is the whole thing of exploding into space, is this all a yang expression?
well, there he is invoking Pan, and that is a whole fertility ritual. Now, what I want to do, since we have limited time, is give you kind of the TKO of the episode here. And it's a little bit, and remember in the background, they're calling it Babylon Working. That is the Crowley name for what these people were up to. And by the way, when Parsons was doing the rituals with Hubbard, one of the things he was saying was, we're going deep, we're doing these rituals, we're conjuring these beings. And, Hubbard was saying, I'm going to be your little scribe. I'm going to be coming along and doing all these things. But in fact, it's very interesting because they're conjuring and the Babylon Working and all these different things. Crowley looked down upon it and said, this is very dangerous what they're doing. And, basically it's a whole Frankenstein waiting to happen. So somebody like Crowley, who had taken this thing over the edge, was definitely afraid of what they were going to unleash, basically, opening this portal onto humanity. All right. Pay close attention to something very odd in the middle of all this. Now disassociated from JPL and Aerojet, Parsons and Foreman founded Ad Astra Engineering Company, which under Parsons was chemical manufacturing Vulcan Powder Company. Ad Astra was subject to FBI investigation under suspicion of espionage when security agents from the Manhattan Project discovered that Parsons and Foreman had procured a chemical used in a top secret project for a material only known as, are you ready?
Mhm.
X metal. But they were later acquitted of any wrongdoing. Have I not referred you to how many times they got off for this? Well, now take it in mind. Think about X metal. Think about Monica Reza and Mondaloy, and think about the original metal that they had developed, the nickel alloy that they had developed early on, which was around in this period. Again, there's something about the metal when you get around the UFO file, rocketry, these patents, something in the heart of it comes up, metal alloy, over and over again. Parsons continued to financially support Smith and Helen, although he asked for a divorce from her and ignored Crowley's commands by welcoming Smith back to the parsonage when his retreat was finished. Parsons continued to hold OTO activities at the parsonage and began renting rooms at the house to non-Thelemites, including journalist Neeson Himmel, Manhattan Project physicist Robert Koenig, and science fiction artist Louis Goldstone. You have a Manhattan Project scientist living with Parsons. You know, so this guy has incredible pull behind the scenes. It's something that we don't see. He's referred to by the top rocket guy as the third best of all time. He's got, you know, the Secretary of the Joint Chiefs shacking up with him, and now he's got a Manhattan.
Well, a few of the best parties. I mean, that's kind of easy, right?
I happen to think, and just like the FBI was keeping an eye on him, look, you've got the Knights of Malta, and you have all these groups doing their stuff. And then here is this kind of Crowley aspect. And there, remember, Crowley was part of MI6. He was brought in to do spying and all the rest of it for British intelligence. So I think what you're looking at are groups overlaid with groups. And it's very interesting that the Maxwells come up later, because I think they're a direct extension of this. But what is the overwhelming signature of it all? It's aerospace, because he, after all, is the real father of our rocket program. Yes.
Well, are we talking about power here?
Yes.
And
yeah.
That is the thing, is that
spirits of the air.
yeah.
Right. I think about that Lindbergh thing where he's flying across the Atlantic and he's got the swastika, you know, painted into his engine to make sure he has the good luck doing the first transatlantic flight. And in the middle of it, as he's about to break through and land in Paris, all these voices come into the plane and they're all like, oh, we're going to make it. All this stuff is going to happen. And like, he's looking around like, am I going nuts? What's going on here? What type of a thing is that? Well, that is this thing about the spirits of the air. Here is humanity going back into this technological period. And obviously there's a lot of discarnate entities of some kind or another that are coming in as part of this. And that's the mystical edge of it all. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew. X Series 224, the Occult Aerospace Ritual, NASA JPL 666. Caltech UFO file. We're going to take a couple more questions and we'll do some shout outs and we're done for the evening. What do you got?
Roger Claiborne. When superstitious occultist psychics summon UFOs, they think it's the ritual, but really it's just their psychic will and intent that did it. Psychic will, intent, and passion is all you need. And Mike Rotunda says, this is what I think the CE5 contact that Greer does is all about, because I looked into it and it actually works. They're summoning something because when you do this, orbs come to you.
Well, think of a Ouija board. When you deal with a Ouija board, and you know, Casey talks about discarnate entities, right? And discarnate entities are all types of varieties. And a discarnate entity is like a ghost, like Steiner was talking about. It could be a relative, it could be anything. And it could, you know, it could be a guiding spirit or whatever. But the idea is a discarnate is something which was physical but hasn't moved on from the physical plane yet. So it's in its ether body. And that's what we get a lot with ghosts and things of this nature. All right. Now, when people think about this, and it's funny because I have an example where Steiner says, what if an alien landed on Earth? And he goes through this whole thing, and he's talking about, he's going through in very interesting detail about what if there was another being that was from the solar system, similar enough to man, like if he came here, he wouldn't understand anything, but he would understand the portrait that Leonardo did of the Last Supper, because, it's automatically would convey all these things to any type of a being. Well, it's very interesting because when you think about all the discussions about aliens and things of this nature, there have been discussions about other beings always, right? And it's just that because they're basically realm jumpers, it's not the kind of thing that exists in our physical concrete world. We have a whole history of elementals. Steiner talks about elementals and how some are hostile to humanity and some love humanity and want to, help it move forward. Steiner at one point discusses how there are elementals out there that want humanity to set up artificial intelligence type things and artificial intelligent type structures so that the machinery goes on and the elementals don't have to deal with humanity anymore, but they can operate and express themselves through all the things that we have built for them. So there's all kinds of strange, unusual things there. I started the show off with the whole idea of Nephilim and how it's this kind of, thrown out there track, or when people, Congress, when woman Luna is like, hey, the Book of Enoch explains aliens, and JD Vance says UFOs are demons, and what I wanted to do, and I've thought about it for a while, is just putting out a UFO picture per day and say, hey, look, JD, an alien, a demon. I mean, they're dragging in their own, lens religiously and others into things that are completely should be in a completely objective point of view. And you wouldn't say, just strictly scientific, but for that type of activity, you'd have to have some kind of a baseline, because you can't have people saying, well, you know what? I was taught growing up that aliens are demons. So therefore, I'm going to say that aliens are demons if we get any proof and come forward. Well, that would be like basically, I was going to say retarded disclosure. You can't say it any other way. I mean, it's ridiculous, and you've had craft all over this world, reports of it, the best pilots, you've had presidents assassinated over it. You've had all these different things happen about it, and you're just going to wind it up at, hey, aliens are demons, UFOs are demons. That's it. Because Luna wants to get the Christians on board with, whatever she's up to. And JD Vance is like, well, when I look through my Christian lens, look, when you are a Christian, you don't have to talk about it that much. You don't have to constantly refer to it unless you're just reinforcing your voter base. All right. And so you don't have to bang people over the head with it, unless you're a teacher and it's part of what you do. But when you're up there as a politician, you should kind of try to represent as many people as possible. Just like the people who try to take Christ and Christian ideas out of the schoolroom are wrong. We had a separation of church and state a long time ago, but it didn't mean eliminate the idea of, the 10 Commandments or these things that the culture needs. So there has to be a balance to this, and there's a terrible imbalance in everything whenever it gets around control over these things. So the revelation to humanity, the militarists on the deep state side want to create a UFO threat. That's what they've been about. They've been doing a great job, winding this up and creating a defense grid. But one of their big problems is they're worried that they can't get Christians to get on board with it, which I think is limited thinking anyway, because I think Christians could understand. Why wouldn't they understand, And we're talking about really hardcore Christians. I consider myself a Christian. But I think it's interesting when we get into these things, because if you really get into it, look, J. Allen Hynek said to his assistant just before he died that more and more that he thought about it in relation to aliens, that it relates to the Theosophy book that Rudolf Steiner wrote. Well, I always loved that book, Steiner writing about Theosophy. But the star of that book are elementals who do all these things, good and bad, around humanity. And so here's J. Allen Hynek, who studied UFOs for the government originally and then outside of the government, and had this great incredible background, and he thinks it's Steiner's elementals. That's what he's thinking that it is. So we may have completely misappropriated the idea of, oh, there's a space-faring culture out there, and they're coming here to visit us. That might be a complete misnomer. In fact, it could be something coexisting with us, or it could be an off-world visitor. We don't know. But the idea that you can kind of say, well, since it's interdimensional, it's going to be demons and we'll fight demons. And here's $2 trillion for a UFO defense budget. That Golden Dome is going to shoot down those demons, baby. That's the way you're going to get people on board. I mean, I think it's ridiculous and it's dangerous. In fact, what they're doing is they're playing with people's version of themselves in the universe, and they're trying to exploit it. That's what we see going on. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, deep, deep tonight into the occult aerospace ritual, NASA JPL 666 Caltech UFO file. And we've taken it into remarkable places tonight. When you think about X-steganography and you realize all the kind of fantastic coincidences, you might say, dots connecting that's gone on about the UFO file in relation to X. And then how we were sitting here giving you the whole background on X and how they were going to roll out X. And then Elon Musk takes over Twitter and makes it X. And now they want to have the X Everything app that includes your money and your lifestyle and everything else. No, the X is at the core of the mystical two-step going on here. And we can't take our eye off the ball on that. And it's very interesting that the thing that they were, with Aerojet trying to take our friend Parsons to jail over is literally because he's working on this X metal. And he came under suspicion of espionage when security agents from the Manhattan Project discovered Parsons' informant had procured a chemical used in a top secret project for a material known only as X metal. By the way, that property was uranium. So, we're getting into that territory. And remember that with the metal, and then think Monica Reza, Aerojet Rocketdyne. There's the crisscross. So there's remarkable things here that overlay each other over decades. The nature of that, I think, takes us into a very interesting place. Miss Olivia, your last two questions.
Okay. So Bibonacci Kalachi says Jack Parsons performed a ritual curse against L. Ron Hubbard after Hubbard absconded with his girlfriend and his money.
Yes.
Any research done into the subsequent deadly explosion at Parsons' house?
Oh, this is the thing. He did, there was a case pending against him. He had done some work for Howard Hughes. And his last 2 years of his life, he died at 37, young guy. The last 2 years of his life, he is going into this process of basically doing any job that he can get, keep himself going. And part of that is still, whenever they have an explosions case, he comes forward and he's a witness, like I said. But they all, he's also doing odd jobs and things. I mean, it's a tough scene for him going from these lofty heights of running, OTO branch in Pasadena and being the star of Caltech and running Aerojet and all that to being brought low. But what happens is he gets some work for Howard Hughes, and it's going to be Howard Hughes Aerospace. And then he gets accused of spying for Israel, which is very strange. Because it's the very beginning of Israel, and supposedly Israel is interested in his and Hughes' rocketry program. This is very early, 1949, 1950, somewhere in there. And so when we look at that, already that's weird. And then when he dies in an explosion, it seems like he's been removed. And in fact, if you want to look at the death of scientists thing, he's a very early version of a scientist being taken out. And the people investigating that, because it was Parsons, they were like, oh, well, he was a chemical rocket guy. He blew himself up. No, I don't think so. I think he was removed and silenced for a lot of reasons. And he had also denounced Crowley and Crowley's method for moving forward into the future. And then Crowley died. And then, so he's on a different track there, but he might know too much, especially with the political connections that he had through THELEMA. So I think there's a very strange end of life there for Parsons. Parsons saw himself as a poet, as a spiritual warrior, as, all these different things. And he thought that, early on his parents' divorce impacted him and he wanted to throw all the rules of society out the window. But every time he tried to achieve these things, he achieved great things. I mean, he created a rocket program, basically, and he was right there. Von Braun found him fascinating. So the level that he was on scientifically was incredible, but mixed with this weird hedonism and like the drug aspect, the sex rituals, all the weird things, the high priest of Thelema thing, the combination, literally. When you think about explosive, his whole life is kind of like an explosion in slow motion. So yeah, but I'm glad you brought that up because he died under very unusual circumstances. And, you might expect that from somebody like Crowley, but not from him. Yes.
Bokro said it's the baby oil.
Wow. Fantastic. I did, I had a description here, which is a preview for something that I have coming up for you, which is this 3-part miniseries, which is going to be a mind blower, and it's going to feature Crowley and some other people. And they're describing some of these rituals. Oh, yeah. Now, it was always wondered, this came from a British newspaper, were they being sensationalist or not? Well, this is Crowley in his prime. You ready? So Crowley appeared. He raised one hand above his head and said, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." To this, I heard half a dozen other voices reply, "Love is the law, love under will." As a general rule, Crowley was not seen by anyone before tea time. He remains in his own room, named Nightmare, as it is called, drugging himself. His room is full of drugs of all sorts. There's a great bottle of raw hashish, bottles of cocaine, heroin, morphine, and ether. He distills his own opium, a lot of which is smoked in the abbey. Whatever dope you like by asking for it. At 4:00, my husband and I were summoned to the nightmare room. Crowley received us lying in his bed, his totally bald head covered with a black wig. Whoa. Talk about, this is really like, he could freak out anybody. At certain periods, Crowley shaves his head like a Buddhist monk. Yeah, sure. He gave us our instructions. He named me Sister Cybele and instructed me to do the cooking, keep the house clean. My husband to the present was to play chess and read with the beast. Once a day, everyone in the colony must come inside the magic circle at 7:30. We all trooped into the temple. The circle is marked on the floor. A great charcoal fire burns at the center. The beast's chair stands on the north side of the circle, with a brazier in front of him and with 6 colored receptacles, or not brazier, or is it? Yes. And for his swords and magic wands. I refused to sit inside the circle and was allowed to remain outside. Incense was burned before Crowley, who was robed in scarlet and wearing magnificent rings. Leah Hersig, a former New York school student, known here as the Scarlet Woman, Crowley's companion and high priestess, was clad in a red robe edged with gold. All the trappings were of indescribable richness. The days went on. My husband was initiated into Crowley's mystic cult of the OTO. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about here. Intense drugs, over the top. This could be like Peter Thiel could be doing these now, sitting there. Like we hear about his Antichrist thing where he sits on a throne and he has these people and it's like they're on either side of them where they can be like pulled on a leash.
I haven't heard that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I was describing, I mean, the leash thing is metaphorical, but remember the Pasolka thing where he sits there and like they won't let anybody film, and he does this whole thing about UFOs and the Antichrist. And then on one side of him, this person described it. They sent me the email. They were in there. They sent me the whole thing. And I said it on a couple of shows ago. I mentioned this. And on one side, he had in front of him like Diana Pasolka, who's this researcher who was trying to put all these things together, and it seems to have like gone way off course because she ran into Teal. And on the other side was the weird Jesse Michaels kid who reps off my show, and he's sitting there like with two of them on either side, giving these weird like, his lecture on what the nature of reality and UFOs and demons, and he's the one who can stand against the Antichrist. Yeah, Peter Thiel is going to stand against the Antichrist. You get problems. Everyone.
Okay, that begs the question.
Yeah.
Does Peter Thiel take drugs?
Oh, I can't say for sure,
Right.
but I would
you don't
think
want
so.
a lawsuit or anything.
Well,
But,
I would
is
think
there any
so.
reputation there for that?
Oh, yeah. No, I don't think it would be a lawsuit. It's hard to nail down. I'm sure in the background, there's a guy who came forward upon the passing of Peter Thiel's boyfriend, who was unceremoniously dumped out of a window of a $13 million condo in Miami, Florida. And that's a weird story. The police questioned Thiel and his husband about that. And that whole story had strangeness. But a guy came forward in relation to that and said he had, that is the male model boyfriend, had drug-fueled parties that Thiel would be at with all these other, it's like basically one big orgy with drugs. So yeah, in answer to your question, that's what I went to when I heard about that, But anyway, Crowley, yeah, he was the epitome of the thing, and he had to take everything to the limit. But it's interesting because, when you think about the drug culture that shows up in the 1960s, these people are doing this stuff 20s and 30s or whatever. And earlier than that, the Golden Dawn, there's something that is coming through there on one hand, and side by side with it is this kind of like spiritual freedom. Like you don't have to be locked into a particular religion. And part of that's going to be necessary because the mystery school thing is going to break people out of a lot of this. And then the downside, the dark side is the people who are going to come in also on the secret society edge are going to bring in all the indulgence of drugs and that whole kind of occult aspect. See, it's a weird mix that's going on there. But what I see happening is the early setup for the 1960s and also the culture itself being psyoped into that, while at the same time, there's incredible, laudable things that came out of the 1960s, including the space program, which, remember, has its both negative and positive impacts. President Kennedy wanted peace in space, wanted that whole type of reality, and wanted to create partners with other countries to go into space to explore it as a sea of scientific exploration and, man's greater destiny and all that kind of thing. And now all these people want to put nuclear reactors and weapons and everything else up there. God knows they probably already have many, many weapons up in space. That's probably what the secret space infrastructure is all about. The only problem, that's a big Frankenstein problem, but the real big problem is that they've gone and done it without checking in with the culture underneath. So, this is the reckoning, that the period of reckoning that we're in here. So building that kind of awareness, building that kind of resistance is absolutely crucial. And so for me, we've kind of touched on all these things tonight, starting with the scientists and even the coverage from mainstream media of my coverage on this. So we've gone many, many places tonight. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think we're done.
Can I end with a really great, interesting
Absolutely,
comment?
yeah.
So Najat says, there's also a thought that man's task is to bring the Christ consciousness into technology for man's ultimate freedom. Could you address that?
Well, I don't think there's any question about it. By the way, there's Dr. Apollo, who was also dealing very closely with Parsons and Melina. Well, guess what? The actual moon programs were all named after Dr. Apollo. when they came up with this idea and they said, oh yeah, the Apollo programs are named after the Greek god. Well, check the record. Who was really behind all this stuff? Dr. Apollo.
What do we know about it?
We'll get into Dr. Apollo a different time, but he's part of this group again, and by the time you get on the moon, you've got one of Parsons' guys there. They've named the program after him. Okay.
He has a Cheshire cat.
Yeah, I know there's great spiritual possibilities with the technology. It takes me back to the whole Atlantean question, which is the Atlanteans, the Amelius group was trying to use the technology, the Two-Eye Stone, to contact the saintly realm, and they would prepare priestesses for that thing, and they'd have the initiates have a purification process. That's how they were using it. The other group was imitative, and this is the Casey story, the Belial group. They imitate the Amelius group. They figure out the technology, and then they use it for conquest. And this is the battle that takes place literally over 100,000 years, and ends up with the big, gigantic takedown of the islands, of the 3 islands that constitute Atlantis at that point, and the last stronghold of the Amelius group. They're in the Bahamas, Cuba, Yucatan Peninsula hot zone. That's what we're talking about. So there's no question to answer her question. That's the spiritualization of the technology is the goal, and their goal is the opposite. It is to cut off any reference to that. Well, that's Steiner's Ahriman story. So these things are starting to converge the more we look at them. And I'll still say this. My impression from reading Steiner all those years, Steiner spent 4 decades trying to warn humanity about Ahriman. That's what he was doing. So here we are. Yes.
I'm sorry. Bo Krill says Dr. Apollo, free candy bumper sticker on his van.
Yeah, he's somebody who's deep in the program. I'll put it to you that way. And with that, Miss Olivia,
Okay.
we're done. Your super chatters are up.
Super chats starting with Ramblin' Lamb,
Uh-huh.
Thomas Ball,
Whew.
Perry Didiascu, Happy Hermit, 3D, Bearded High Priest, Wolfgang McCarthy, Tim Houston, Jake, Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, Debbie McAdoo, Harry Zeri, Amarillo Gunrunner, M. Brox, 2025, Stephen Northcutt, Bricklayer's Daughter, hold on a second, Stephen Northcutt again, Eurythmia's Fun, Real Norman Smith, Erica Swenson Elliott, Dawn Divine, Veronica Bartolini Codebreak, The Drunken Scoundrel, DTM, Made You Trip, Wild Rhino, Bo Krills, Johnny Ricardo, and Ray Story. Thank you so much for your generous super chats. People were incredibly generous tonight because, of course, it is your birthday today.
Yes. Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's great. And, we had quite an impact this week with everything. And that all goes back again to what happens in that incredible synergy with the show and the ideas room. We present the ideas, they ripple out. We might be even a lone outpost of truth with our super friends like Gigi Young and others. And Gigi did a great video today, by the way, all about spirituality before Christ. Highly recommend that. You want to watch that this weekend for sure, because it is powerful. And I always say that Gigi's Remarkable does not get her due, and people who know Gigi's show is that the dedicated following is remarkable, and her impact is gigantic. So you want to be there in the heart of that show. You won't miss it. Gigi Young on YouTube and on gigiyoung.com. Just fantastic work. And we'll have Gigi on this month as well. She's coming back. We have something very special planned for everyone here. Let me do some shout outs here before we leave. Thank you very much. Oh, happy birthday indeed. How sweet it is, right? Absolutely. Tina Boric, great to see you. Wowee, Mike, thank you, sir. It's great to have you out there. Diana Dawn, It's kind of like Golden Dawn, if you think about it. See, my head is in Golden Dawn right now. I can't help it. Let's see. The flux liner lives. Indeed. Can you imagine that thing now? Well, think about it. Our friend McCandlish, he saw that, or it was reported to him, I think 1990 at Norton Air Force Base. So they had a whole redeveloped UFO crash then. What do they got now? This is why they want to roll it out, you know, and JD Vance is going to be riding, saying, I'm fighting demons. The OG Herbert the pervert. That's Dr. See, we've ruined Dr. Apollo's reputation for no reason at all. Come on. It's incredible how real all this is, Najat. Indeed. And people tell me that sometimes. They were like, you know, when I first started listening to your show, I thought these are incredible concepts and things. And then they've all been rolling out our reality. Like, you know, so we've been really ahead of time. The reason that we've been able to be ahead of time is we've put the research and the information out, and we stand on the shoulders of these incredible people who put the mystery schools together in the first place. And if you can only imagine the work and the ripples of somebody like Rudolf Steiner or Edgar Cayce and Blavatsky, I mean, Gurdjieff's work, it's an incredible life-altering experience to encounter that information. And I don't think that's an accident. Buddha of Boston Sports, and that is the real reason we can't have nice things. They use it for conquest. Wow, it's really true.
100%.
Let's see. Most of us tried to make the U.S. a decent nation. It can be, there's no question. And it has an incredible history and background. I don't think the United States, you know, has reached anywhere near its potential, because incredible things can happen here. The people we have here in this country are remarkable. It's government that is a part of the problem. Anyway, DJ, it's so cool that you've moved the needle in the mainstream media. I know. Jenny Jen, indeed. Well, it's very interesting. You know, I have a long history with the media, having been with those guys when I started, but I've come full circle. I always wanted to do independent media because I never wanted to be limited in what I would discover that I could share with other people. So if I discovered something, I wanted to be able to share it. And that's what is limiting about the media. Why being a dark journalist is much better than being, say, an MSNBC journalist. But yeah, that's remarkable. Dr. Apollo. Hey, Dr. Apollo is getting a lot of accolades here at the end tonight. Let's see, who else we got? The Theosophists were proto-hippies. Indeed, indeed they were. And if you look at the shows that we did on that very early group, Radiant Halcyon group, which included the Vice President, Henry Wallace, and how they were guided by the master Hilarion and all that stuff, and they broke off from the regular society, they were really proto-hippies. And I think they built Silicon Valley. I think we made a pretty good case for that. Miami, Miami, Miami. Yes, indeed. Teal footprints in Miami and and beyond. Wow, fantastic. Happy Hermit is out there. Let's see. The people have very effective enemies. We aren't bad. They're just very good. I like that. I think that's true, actually. Faith in both. Yes. I think I found you a few years back on InfoWars. A lot of people tell me that. Yeah. Alex has been sensational for getting these things out there. And what people don't realize about Alex is not only does he know a great deal about these types of subjects, but he's brave enough. He wants the conversation out there. That's what you want. That's what you want. And, you know, he's just made the transition from InfoWars to Alex Jones Network because they had him in that ridiculous lawsuit and stuff. And it's going to be bigger than ever. He's doing great. And I'll be happy to go on his new show there. Happy birthday. Thanks for showing the other side of the smoke and mirrors. Thank you. Well, what a joy it all is. And let's see. Scarlet Fire. Amen, Scarlet. What did Scarlet Fire say that everyone is amening? Hold on. Oh, may all that read this be blessed. Oh, that's great. Isn't that fantastic? Boy, it's been great being here with you. What a wild ride through the decades it has been tonight through the various eras. We're coming back with you next week. Fantastic interviews coming up for May, and then this incredible 3-part miniseries that we're doing, docuseries. That's all coming up for you as well. And let's see if I've left anyone else here. I know Kate's out there. Bo Krill's. That is a great look at Bo Krill's little avatar there. That's something else. Johnny Ricardo, thanks for the great work, Daniel. You rock, man. Thank you. And Miss Olivia, nicely done.
Mm-hmm.
We will see you all next week. And it says end broadcast, but after all,
Never really ends.
it never really ends. And have a fantastic weekend, everyone. We've only begun the fight around getting the missing scientist story out there and getting a congressional hearing and more. And for my money, I want all the people who are trying to push the UFO threat under oath explaining that before Congress. That's going to be something else. And if ever I did a live show, I do it live streaming from there. So have a great night, everyone. And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and there can be again if we just keep our eyes on the prize. So have a fantastic evening, everyone.
God bless everybody.